I'm Andrew Dolkart. I'm the director of the Historic Preservation Program here at Columbia, and I just want to quickly welcome everybody to our Fitch Colloquium, which is an event we try to do every year on an interesting topic in preservation. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for a few people that I need to thank. The Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation has been very generous, and they brought the speakers here for the weekend. And we also tried to raise a little extra money, particularly to pay for lunch, because we've always felt that lunch was a really crucial part of, the socializing at lunch was a crucial part of what this event is all about. So I just want to quickly thank the people that are on the back of the program: Francoise Bollock Architects, Prudon and Partners Architects, Jan Herd Pokorny Associates, Miri Diericks Architectural Preservation Consulting, Wasa Studios, A. Ottavino Corporation, and Shoji and Tsuneko Sodai for their very generous donations today. And the other thing I want to announce is that, except that my phone is now, because I need the date. I want everybody to put on their calendar, next year is the 50th anniversary of the Historic Preservation Program. And we're going to be doing a major Fitch Colloquium on October 18th next year. And we're also, I'm sure everybody will hear from us, because we're also doing major fundraising around the 50th anniversary to ensure that we have at least 50 more years of the Historic Preservation Program. So this event would not have happened without George Wheeler, who's the director of the Conservation Program here in the Historic Preservation Program. And so I'm going to turn it over to George, who's going to introduce the day.
Thanks, Andrew. So 50 years, that's quite an accomplishment. If you looked at the sports page of the New York Times this morning, the lead article was on Columbia University football's dogged futility. So I think we could say we have dogged utility, 50 years. And at times great success, at times brilliance, including the inception of the program by James Marston Fitch. So here we are nearly 50 years later. I also wanted to thank Shoji and Tsuneko Sadao. You might recognize the name Sadao as the firm Fuller and Sadao, Buckminster Fuller. Shoji was Buckminster Fuller's partner for years and worked closely with Isamu Noguchi. And Shoji had the idea that we need to discuss this topic of East-West in preservation, so that's where this arose several years ago. So I wanted to thank Shoji and Tsuneko for that. Just a couple of other thanks. Of course, Tricia Logan and Charlotte Edgerton just keeping us going. Thank you very much. And our students, Melissa Swanson, Karen Stone, Chelsea Brandt, and who am I forgetting? Out there at the desk. Tianchi Yang. Thank you. And then we'll be moderating the sessions. So this morning's session will be moderated by Ann Van Ingen, who's the chair of the Preservation League of New York. So Ann, thanks for agreeing to do that. So help her along, ask questions respectfully. It's when you're moderating, it's always good to help the moderator by not making long statements, but actually asking pointed questions. So let's help her along. We've all experienced both sides of that. So I'd like to just say a word or two about our speakers this morning. Our first speaker will be Anton Schweizer, who's an assistant professor at the University of Heidelberg, studying Japanese art history. And we're lucky to have him here in New York on a 2-year fellowship at the New York University Institute of Fine Arts through the Mellon Foundation. He was also, by the way, trained as a restorer, in addition to his skills as he's developed in art history. Our second speaker will be Theo Prudon, which we can say is truly one of our own, one of the first graduates of the program, and has been teaching here for, what's the number, 40 years? Something like that. They blend in after a while. So, and Theo has a vibrant international practice. So welcome, Theo. Vincent Michael, as you can see, is the executive director for Global Heritage Fund. He's also the chair of the preservation program at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, and a former chair of NICP, which is the education foundation that discusses how preservation education should be conducted. So Vincent, welcome. Also a vibrant international practice. And finally, Lee Ambrozy is a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She's working with Professor Jonathan Hay. So I tried to pin her down on her PhD topic this morning, which she equivocated a little bit. So Lee, welcome and thanks for coming. So without further ado, Anton, please let us begin.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Columbia University, the graduate school, and in particular George Wheeler for inviting me to speak today. Is the PowerPoint up right now? It is not. No, it's opening. It's reopening. I can see it. Wonderful. That's wonderful. So, Japanese conservation practice has, generally speaking, the reputation of being exemplary. This is so in particular as regards to transmission of historical production techniques, the unaltered preservation of material substance, and an essential devotion to material integrity. In the West, praise is given especially to the categorizing system for tangible and intangible cultural property, the latter of which includes the title of a living national treasure that is a specialist craftsman or craftswoman who perfectly masters a specific set of manufacturing techniques and is selected as human embodiment and faithful transmitter of these to future generations. Many of these principles find direct applications in the field of conservation and restoration. It is frequently overlooked, though, that there is actually a wide range of dealing with issues of originality and authenticity according to various fields, such as painting, architecture, or objects, and that there frequently are divergent approaches even within the same field. Confronted with actual examples of Japanese conservatory practice, among Western restorers there's arguably an equal measure of praise for the outstanding precision of workmanship, as there is fundamental critique of what is perceived as flippancy in dealing with historical substance. In the following paper, I will present a specific case from my field of specialization, that is early modern architecture, and single out the problem of surface coatings. I will do so from my disciplinary background, namely that of a historian of art and architecture, with a strong interest in issues of conservation. What I hope to demonstrate is that there are many cases in transcultural conservatory practice where there is no immediate right or wrong, but that decisions frequently depend on cultural and disciplinary context. So let's approach this step by step. I'm going to first define what we are talking about, that is, define the terms I use. Then I will give a short interpretation of the type of architectural decoration which I am particularly interested in. That is what I call lacquered architecture. And this will then be followed by a discussion of historical and modern approaches to maintaining, conserving, and curating buildings that employ this kind of surface coating. The vast majority of pre-modern Japanese architecture is made from wood, using sophisticated techniques of joining. The traditional way of maintenance is to execute minor repairs over time, for instance, of the roofing. And once the building has deteriorated to a greater extent, the entire structure is dismantled, sometimes only in part or sometimes completely, and the damaged components are replicated of some of the still functional components. By using this method, the original appearance of a building can be preserved over a long period of time, even if after multiple cycles of aging and repair, only little of the original substance is still there. Maybe most familiar to a wider audience is the practice of cyclical rebuilding in Japan's indigenous religion, or Shinto. According to this practice, for ritual reasons, this practice is observed for many, but by no means all shrine buildings in the country. The main shrine buildings are completely dismantled and entirely replicated in new materials according to a fixed rotation. Famously, this is done once in 20 years at the shrines of Ise. When the new buildings are erected, one can see the old and the new shrine precinct next to each other on two adjacent plots. So, this one is the empty plot for the shrine to come, and this one is the shrine in operation. And here you see the case you have once in 20 years. The old one is still standing, and the new one is already completed. After the deity has been ritually relocated to the new set of buildings, the old one is discarded and the plot left empty until the next renewal approaches. Much less discussed in the West is the field of architectural coloring. In this context, I prefer to sharply distinguish between conventional coloring with mineral pigments bound in animal glue, here, also vegetable oil, and then proper lacquering. It's this one here, which involves a complex build-up of priming and a subsequent coating with East Asian sap lacquer, or urushi. The materials, manufacturing steps, aesthetic qualities, and also the aging behavior of these two distinct technologies are rather different. I will talk here about the latter, that is lacquering. The lacquer is a natural product. It comes from the East Asian lacquer tree, which is a relative of poison ivy, and is gathered in a similar way to rubber cultivation. The employment of lacquer for interior decoration began probably during the Heian period, that's from roughly about 800 to 1200. And at the latest, from about the 12th century, it was mainly used for Buddhist cult halls in the interior. In profane context, lacquer turns up much later, roughly since the 15th century, and is then typically limited to small and particularly distinguished areas of high-ranking rooms, such as the decorative alcove or the ceremonial entrance of the host. What I want to focus on in this paper is extensive lacquering at the exterior, a peculiar phenomenon that seemingly first came up in the late 16th century. Exterior lacquering is an important characteristic of this period, the so-called Momoyama period, and turns up commonly in combination with relief sculpture, which is then polychromized with conventional coloring. So this is lacquer, and this is conventional coloring, and together with paintings and gilded metal fittings. Typically, lacquering of this type is plain and black, but there are also exceptions. There also are red buildings. And it extends over all parts of the building which would ordinarily be in plain wood. That is the constructive frame, the board walls, the door panels, gable pediments, and even floors and ceilings. To lacquer an entire building is a highly laborious, time-consuming, and expensive task. A typical build-up comprises numerous steps, about 25 to 30, the most important of which are the sizing. Yeah, you can see it actually right here. Then a textile lining of the entire wooden component, a sequence of priming layers, and then the lacquering proper. Why was this done, and what does it mean? Until quite recently, lacquered architecture of this kind was described with stereotype phrases like ostentation and magnificence. Sometimes the lacquering was also explained as a protective coating. It is true that wood under the lacquer buildup deteriorates much slower than untreated wood, but I think it has to be kept in mind that a quite similar protective effect can be produced through conventional coloring or, for instance, also by applying drying oils, both of which would be considerably cheaper and by far less laborious to apply. I am convinced, therefore, that the aesthetic and material qualities played a principal role in the decision to employ this type of decoration. Particularly significant, according to my interpretation, is the connotative field that surrounded lacquered objects in the pre-modern period in Japan. First of all, now it doesn't move. Okay, here we go. Good. Thank you. First of all, lacquer was associated with ritual implements. Icons, sutra scrolls, and relics were customarily preserved in small shrines called zushi, which are virtually always lacquered in black. In many cases, zushi are designed as more or less elaborate miniature architectures. And Buddhist paraphernalia in general were frequently lacquered in black, as we can see here. So this is an altar setting and tables with ritual offerings, and then stages for discussants of the sutra. Thus, the visual accord of black lacquer with gold metal fittings was connoted with Buddhist ritual. Furthermore, I think that the deep color saturation and the high degree of gloss played a crucial role. Gloss and radiance are some of the omnipresent indicators of supernatural presence in Buddhist texts. Gloss is also linked to water, the primary agent of ritual purification in the Shinto belief system. And, as research of the semantics of Heian period textiles has demonstrated, strong color values, and particularly such extreme degrees of color saturation that almost approximate black, were imbued with a complex set of notions concerning vitality, life force, newness, and splendor. These notions were articulated in language and also linked with the optical qualities of light reflection and luminosity. Gloss and strong color were therefore almost synonymous with beauty and otherworldly splendor. I believe that the lacquered buildings conveyed the somewhat irreal impression of a magnified and monumentalized ritual implement. Now let us turn to the material characteristics of lacquer and their meaning. Contrary to common notion, East Asian lacquer, urushi, is not a very suitable material for exterior use. In fact, it is highly vulnerable to ultraviolet light. After only a few years of continuous exposure to the sun, the molecular structure begins to break apart. The original deep black and highly lustrous appearance gradually assumes a grayish, faded, and dull look. About 2 decades later, humidity can penetrate the layered buildup, causing an even faster decay. Finally, the beige grounding layers become visible and start to fall off in huge flakes. To renew such an extensive lacquer coating is even more tedious than the original process of applying, since the residual fragments of the old coating have to be beaten off millimeter-wise with a hammer. After that, an entirely new build-up of lacquering is applied in a sequence, starting again from filling in the cracks, going over the textile lining, the priming, lacquering, burnishing, and then the final lacquer coating. How often was this done? We can guess the frequency of limited repairs and outright recoating campaigns from documents which are in existence for some buildings and from scientific investigation of building areas where traces of consecutive treatments have survived. Quite surprisingly, all the evidence indicates that usually there were several decades between major relacquering works. One shrine in particular, the Osaki Hachimangu in Sendai, is an unusually well-documented building that we saw already before. This building seems to have been subject to comprehensive relacquering campaigns at an average of about 40 to 60 years. In other words, the lacquered works of architecture stood always only for a few years in the initial mirror gloss and deep black. For the most part of their life, these buildings were exposed to the public gaze in various stages of weathering and ultimately decay. The difference in visual appearance between new and aged is tremendous. The creators must have, of course, known that. Based on a number of leads, I am convinced that the intrinsic ephemerality of these lacquer coatings and the rapid optical change of the original splendor into its virtual opposite were not just a constant nuisance for which relief was given only so scarcely because of the high costs. Rather, I think that the material of lacquer was chosen for its very temporal character. Again, a look at the field of ritual implements and small format luxury items is illuminating. Both in religious and secular context, the commissioning of new lacquer objects was frequently connected to specific occasions. Containers for sutra scrolls, incense, cosmetics, and writing utensils were ordered for festivities as, for instance, the refurbishment of a temple, the taking of an office, or the wedding of a daughter. The ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi, for instance, commissioned in 1586 a substantial set of lacquered objects from the distinguished Koami lacquer workshop to be used for the enthronement ceremonies of Emperor Go-Yosei. And not only were lacquer sets produced newly, occasionally also ancient items were re-lacquered. A famous saddle, which belonged to Hideyoshi, now in the Tokyo National Museum, is actually a much older item, with an inscription from the year 1445. In 1577, it was re-lacquered on Hideyoshi's orders and newly decorated with a design of dotted reed grass in gold relief after a sketch by his favorite painter Kano Eitoku. The year in which this re-lacquering was done, 1577, marked an important step in Hideyoshi's career because he became the lord of Himeji Castle to the southwest of Kyoto. Thus, there existed a long tradition to create new objects and to refurbish old ones by a complete renewal of the exterior appearance. And lacquer was a particularly prominent material in this practice. Renewal and restoration were key components of the political discourse of the Momoyama period when this practice emerged, and it seems to me crucial to notice that these buildings were erected within a comprehensive culture of temporal installments that served as public statements. I suggest that not only the visual appeal and the novelty of the lacquered buildings, but the very quality of newness contributed substantially to the overall iconographic statement. Corresponding to interior rooms which were furnished with newly painted walls and sliding doors, paintings on walls and sliding doors, and to temple halls which were hung with recently donated textiles, a religious institution could be patronized through giving a fresh lacquer coating to its principal buildings. And in a way similar to textiles, the precious gift would gradually fade and then assume the quality of venerable decay, as one poem of the 1620s has it. So the gradual depletion of the glossy surface seems to have been experienced not as a defect, but as the natural course of events, ultimately leading to a new cycle of creation and decay. So how should buildings of this type be approached by modern conservation? The mandatory preservation of historical lacquer coating stands, I think without question, for cases like this, in which the lacquer is decorated. This is the famous Golden Hall of Chuzonji Temple in Hiraizumi. Most of the surfaces we see here are also lacquer. The Golden Hall is today built over with a protective structure made of concrete and glass that is designed to screen off ultraviolet light, wind and rain, and to establish a stable climate. The presence of the protective structure is, of course, a massive intervention that removes the hall from the surrounding temple precinct, which is situated on a hill with lush vegetation. The case of this Golden Hall is all the more stunning because it is one of the earliest instances where a historical building was regarded early on so outstanding that it should be preserved. Right next to the modern protective building, there is another protective hall that was erected over the Golden Hall in the 13th century. So this is decorated lacquer, which obviously was regarded as exceptional and worth being preserved. But how about the much more numerous cases of plain lacquering? What is the original state of such buildings anyway? Is the authentic substance and the authentic aesthetic appearance that of the first build-up of lacquer that was applied at the time of the erection, and should this be preserved? Certainly there is some value to this opinion, for the manufacturing technologies of lacquer are, as everything else, subject to innovation and small improvements over time. It is therefore of great interest for specialists to have reliable information about the methodology of lacquering in the 16th and 17th centuries. But as we have seen, lacquered buildings were customarily re-lacquered in relatively long temporal distance from the last renewal, similar to the practice of renewing the architectural polychromy with what I have called conventional colors. In the pre-modern practice, the original state concerns only a brief and elusive point in time. And as I have tried to demonstrate, the material transitoriness is part of the iconographical and ontological argument. Today, there are several fundamentally different approaches in simultaneous use in Japan. In cases where the original wooden substance was completely lost at some point, for instance due to war or conflagration, it is still sometimes advocated to execute reconstructions in concrete, steel, plastic, and oil or acrylic color. Here we see a bridge which imitates the original joined wood construction in steel. With the ornamental post cappings originally made from gilded copper, replicated in molded plastic, and the vermilion lacquer substituted in oil color. The stone substructure remains that of the original bridge. This is, of course, a radical solution, and I guess that almost all Western conservators would object to this approach. But there is also disagreement about more subtle differences in approach. This is a relatively small memorial building, also from the 17th century, lacquered, painted, leaf gilded at the interior and exterior. After the last relacquering campaign, the entire thing was overbuilt with a protective hall made from concrete. While the interior of this protective structure is openly modern, the exterior is designed in an eclectic combination of elements from traditional Japanese architecture, obviously to better fit into the wider temple compound to which the memorial building belongs. I believe quite a number of Western conservators would feel most comfortable with this kind of solution. Yet again, this constitutes a heavy intrusion since the structure is removed from the ritual context of the surrounding temple. And the intended cycle of creation and decay is effectively stopped, the building frozen in an arbitrarily defined original state. The majority of lacquered buildings is treated, however, according to traditional practice. But also here there are inconsistencies. The Osaki Hachiman shrine, which we encountered already before, can again serve as an intriguing example. During the last major restoration campaign, which ended in 2004, the structure was partially dismantled, painstakingly documented and consolidated so that it survived the heavy earthquake and tsunami catastrophe of 2011, with only minor damage. During the restoration, the exterior was comprehensively re-lacquered and the sculptural polychromy renewed. At the interior, however, an entirely different procedure was applied. While the lacquering was reconstructed, also here, the sculptural polychromy and the wall paintings were approached in a way that is much closer to Western ideals and to what is done at museums with works of painting. The rationale is quite clear, since to remove the wall and ceiling paintings would constitute a heavy loss of authentic substance. Yet, to a Western observer, this selective approach seems arbitrary, and the individual components of the resulting interior aesthetic, so to say, restored apart. There are also cases in which even painting on the exterior is completely renewed, as in this example, the Kunosan Toshogu Shrine. Paintings at the exterior are, however, rarely older than the early 20th century. In some cases, protective paints of glass or acrylic have been mounted over such paintings, but very obviously these bring up in turn serious aesthetic concerns. So these are polychromized relief carvings which are covered by an acrylic paint. So how should we evaluate the diverse approaches towards lacquered surfaces? Generally speaking, I think that the rejection by Western observers of the practice to remove historical paintings is quite easy to consent with. But where does the fundamental discomfort with the complete renewal of exterior lacquer coatings, which most Western observers maintain, ultimately result from? I will not attempt to find a definite answer to this difficult question in this paper, but I would like to put up for discussion if there are not preconceptions about works of architecture and art that are deeply embedded to Western, that is mostly European thinking. The art historian Alois Riegel, for instance, postulated in his influential essay, The Modern Cult of the Monuments, 1903 published, that the value of a monument or historical landmark building is based not only on its artistic and historical significance, but also on its agency to materialize and actualize history, or in Riegel's words, the embodiment of time that it has lived through. A similar but less precisely formulated positive evaluation of age and the material traces of aging can be found in the work of John Ruskin, who famously criticized most interventions of restorers that went beyond the basic conserving of material substance. And later, the philosopher Walter Benjamin coined the term of the aura, a metaphysical and almost spiritual quality that distinguishes, as he argues, the authentic work of art that the master artist created and touched with his or her own hands, from a copy which is, in his definition, a merely technical reproduction. It has to be noted, however, that the original artwork and its recovery in authentic appearance through intervention of a restorer is a fiction, also for the field, say, of Renaissance panel paintings. Even if dirt, brown varnishes, and later retouchings are removed, the original substance remains aged. It will have cracks, an originally flat surface will have warped up into a relief texture, and some pigments will have discolored. But these are commonly accepted and even cherished in the West as tokens of an aged original. The standpoint of the majority of Japanese conservators is that the preservation of historical substance is frequently directly opposite to the preservation of historical appearance. From this perspective, the re-lacquered surface of a shrine building is actually closer to the original than the preservation of deteriorated surface fragments would be. As I said in the beginning, if closely investigated, there is no easy wrong or right in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. We have a lot to come up then in our question and answer session. So we'll save all of the questions until that time, and I'd like to invite our second speaker, Theo Prudon, to the podium. Thank you.
I think when you start preparing a speech for a conference with a very specific subject, you always wonder why you didn't hear the speeches that other people are giving. And I realized that there are words in Anton's presentation that you will see back. And I think there are also some images that you will see back. But I think that what I would like to do is sort of take you on a journey for looking at buildings and looking at a very different scale of conservation, or maybe the lack thereof. Because I think that part of what we're looking at here is the question that I think I would sort of like to put up as to how, when I started this, which is really the question, is there a difference? And I think, as we heard before, there is a difference, certainly in the pre-modern period. And if that difference is there, how does that then translate in the period that we're talking about, that I'm talking about, which is really 1930s and really particularly post-World War II. And finally then, all of this, what does that mean in the reality of what's happening on the ground? Because occasionally there's a theory, but then at the end of the day, there's the realism of practice. And when I started this, I thought, but maybe I should start at the other end. I should look at how we, and I think some ways comes back to Anton's presentation, is how we have looked at Eastern, for lack of a better word, art in general. And I'm showing you here an image of the tea house behind Marble House in Newport, which was designed by Hunt and Hunt. I think finished about 1914, was probably used for about 3 years, and of course then was abandoned after with the onslaught of World War I. That building has been, 20 years ago, been impeccably restored. And there is basically an attempt here also to try as much as possible to pick up the craft and the ability of the original workshop and the work that was being done in the construction of it. And it's probably fairly close in some ways to the pre-modern Japanese or Chinese architecture that was discussed before. Here is the question that comes up. It's partially the renewal, which is what we heard also in the lack of painting, and partially that it's really not on the original location. It's moved 75 feet back from the water because of the deterioration of the seawall in Newport. So again, here we're introducing then the question of newness versus age value, as well as the issue of reconstruction and relocation. Because this is the way it was when I first saw it. And you can see it had been closed since World War I and had basically been abandoned until the restoration in the 1980s. This is an example that you hear about from Jack Waite, which is the house that is being moved into, has been moved into the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, an 18th century Chinese house. And I think again goes back to the discussion before, the museological approach versus what happens to age and to value, and how we then relate it back to what happens in the Japanese or Chinese tradition. And I think just one example, as I said, Jack will talk about this more. And of course, we talked about the Ise temple. And it's really interesting, partially because of the cultural symbol that it becomes after World War II, when Japanese culture and society begins to refine itself within the modern world. But also, it's interesting, it shows up in the preservation literature. It shows up in the preservation literature probably in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's interesting that on the issue of reconstruction comes back into the discussion. And you can see again, as in the earlier paper, that the question about how we as modern preservationists and conservationists approach the whole question of reconstruction. And you may ask yourself, why do I start here? Because the subject is modern architecture. But I think the connection is that in the discussion and in the dialogue, we are beginning to talk more and more about reconstruction as part of the ongoing process of preservation, particularly where it relates to the temporality of modern materials. And you can see, again, looking at the words and the discussion about the lacquers is very, very much relevant to where we are in this case. And I think you saw the whole issue of the 20-year renewal cycle with the new site next door and the old site being abandoned. And again, the continuation of the tradition of the craft and the tradition that's built into the reconstruction. And then, of course, I went back to our founder and see what he wrote about it in when the book Historic Preservation, the Cultural Management came out, which I think is in the mid-1980s. And again, here already it shows up again. The Ise Temple is here. The recognition that it's part of that preservation process is already here, as reconstruction be something that has a valuable significance within. And I think that what for us is confusing, at least for me has been confusing, is this whole continuation of tradition and craft. And it goes, we have heard references back to Ruskin and its scrape versus anti-scrape. For us, the romance of the craft is something that I think has sometimes muddled the vision as to how we approach preservation on our end, but also how we have looked at what others are doing, particularly in the Far East. And I'm showing you here a temple in Korea. where it's a 17th century temple. But then when I look next door, they're actually building the same thing. But it's a slight shift because I'm sure they were using power tools. So there is that tradition, but it's really not tradition the same way. So there are these shifts that are taking place that we are necessarily being conscious of or being recognized. And again, we reference back to the lacquers or the coatings, there is that same kind of dilemma that is there as part of that discussion. But it's on subtle things. This is an example of a scaffolding in Kyoto. I think OSHA would have serious problems with it, but the way that the wires are twisted is actually almost like packaging, although clearly from a structural point of view, it is doing a very good job. So then if we look at modern architecture in the context of the Far East, and I think the definition here is I'm not talking about India because it's a whole different aspect, not about Cambodia or Thailand, really focusing on Korea, Taiwan and Japan as to the cultures that in the post-World War II period saw an enormous amount of reconstruction and an enormous amount of building of new architecture. So what we see is basically a tradition of conservation and preservation that is actually probably fairly close to what we do. And what I'm showing you here is the plan of a Japanese cigar factory in Taiwan, in Taipei, which actually has been converted by the Taiwanese government into the Taiwanese Design Center. And I think there is that other aspect here is that there is this transition which is affecting preservation design and preservation policy with an emphasis on design. So we see a culture moving away from manufacturing and making things into, as they say, designed in Taiwan. So there's a whole cultural change, and what we see here is taking this 1930s concrete cigar factory and turning it into a design center. So really there's something here that is very much almost Western and certainly in the design sense something we can very easily recognize. And again, the interior of this, one of those manufacturing sheds, is both structurally, historically, fairly much of a contemporary Western construction, but also in terms of how the new design is inserted into it, is not any significantly different from what we were doing, what we will be doing in our same time. And that comparison extends itself further. This is an image of the General Post Office in Tokyo, which clearly from looking at the architectural detail, you can see is probably mid-1930s. This was a major preservation battle, whereby it was a low-rise building in a high-density district. And you can see the discussion here becomes almost like Midtown East, whereby the idea of high-rise density development is really something that plays all throughout these cultures as one of the pressures on preservation. Because this is what they did. It's now called JP Tower. And as I said, we could go back and look at this and see that even in our own preservation discussions in the 1970s, this was sort of the evolution that developed in terms of dealing with the idea that real estate has to be maximized. And I'll come back to that because I think that is a very much an underlying theme that we haven't really recognized. When you look at the post-war period, you look at the generations, particularly in Japan, where architects had either worked for Corbusier or Gropius or had been in Western education or had looked at this, began to design buildings that are very much like the ones we know. And again, I could have taken a number of examples of Ken Satange in terms of how his architecture becomes a major international feature. And part of that, of course, then means that the preservation of that becomes different. That doesn't mean that the preservation of difficult modern buildings isn't equally culturally there as much as it is here. In other words, how do you deal with buildings that have a very, I wouldn't say bad reputation, but have an aura to it that really relates back to what the occupancy is. And this is one of the buildings they point out to you in Seoul, Korea, where this Secret Service here was monitoring somebody across the street. And of course, when the regime changed, they abandoned the building, and there it is. But clearly, it's a very important building as a modern building, but also because of its connotation. So the difficult history that's there and pervades this is very much something that everybody has to deal with. And then we can go and look, and you'll see these styles that we know from our own architectural history in terms of, for example, brutalism. Here is Kunimekawa's Tokyo Festival Hall, which is very much being used. And so, again, there is a continuation of an architectural tradition that's Western rather than a connection back to their particular history. The building is fully occupied and in use, and I think I put this image in because it reminds me of Parapluie de Cherbourg by Michel Lacan. It's this image there of all these umbrellas upside down against the ceiling. I'm sure it's a acoustical device, but it's kind of an art kind of a solution. And again, here, looking at the capsule tower, thank you, Jessica, for your image that you'll see next. It's really something that is very much part of that metabolism architecture that presents problems that are far more contemporary and really remote from this whole discussion of East versus West preservation. I think the other part here is that what we also realize here is that we sometimes forget the enormous significance of the building in the context. Look at how low-rise that location around that building is, so that the building itself is far more prominent than something we would recognize today. But of course, the building is partially empty and has very serious seismic problems, so the question as to what will happen to it is really a question that remains. And I think I sort of kind of like the overpowering of life of architecture that certainly is something that happens in every culture that we were looking at. Again, I'm just trying to go back and forth here, but if you look at Habitat 67, which is about the same period of time, it's the same kind of concept. It's the idea architecturally of creating these individual units that are stacked together in a fairly random process. So you see that the cultural connections are far larger, certainly in the post-war period, and so as a result of that also in the preservation that we really see so far. And in many ways, the regulatory framework exists. There's been reference to the Japanese, and the Japanese will point out to you that they've had the legislation in place since the end of the 19th century that is not dissimilar from what the Monument Historique was doing in France. So from a regulatory point of view, it's very much in place. And I'm showing you two pamphlets out of Singapore, and in a conversation with the lady who runs the preservation program, and if you know, it's the Urban Redevelopment Agency. So it is clearly the emphasis on redevelopment. And when I talked to her, she went through this whole discussion as to what the criteria were. And then it could be English heritage. But at the end, she said, first, the owner has to agree, and two, it has to make economic sense. And as a result of that, there's a whole lot of factors that got built into the preservation process that was beyond the cultural aspects that we would normally look at. There's no question, again, back to the low-rise discussion, that there's a great deal of protection, for example, in Singapore, of shop houses as they were built at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. But this is done what happens. This is looking back at the government center, which is 1930s. It's relatively low-rise, but see what happens built around it. So that the pressure of density, the pressure of economic development, the pressure of building up, which is similar to, as I said a few minutes ago, to our own discussion around Midtown East, is not that dissimilar. And then, when you look at the plans that I had, is that I've now moved 90 degrees to the left, is a new city that is almost totally new development. So you can see that this is actually built now. And the image is about 5 years ago. And so it is actually built. So you can see that the preservation battle there is as much an economic one as it is a technical or a sophisticated one. Because again, the pressure of development is so high. There's one aspect that I think I have seen very little on. Most of these countries in the post-World War II period have built enormous housing. And again, I'm taking an example of the Singapore, where the Singaporean, most of this is rental. So basically, in an economy where rental housing is being provided, much of that is being demolished, partially for social cultural reason, but also I think again because of development. And there's some discussion about Hong Kong, there's some discussion about Singapore, but certainly not much of a preservation point of view, which is kind of interesting because it's so much part of the program of development they did in the 50s and 60s. All of this started for me in a sense with when we were looking at the World Monuments Fund's Nobel Prize jury this year. And we were all surprised when one of the projects was a school designed in southern Japan, Hizuchi, and came to us as one of the examples for the prize. And what was interesting about it is that in my mind, it's a 50s building by a local regional architect with an extension that was built by, again, a consortium of people in Japan. And here is where I think my question about tradition and craft and sensibility just come back in again, because when it comes down to that, it's very much there. When you're looking at the image, and I'm sure Lisa will talk about it in the programs related to the World Monuments Fund, if you look at it in the image, you'll see that the front part is old, but there's a new extension that is clearly new, but it's still within the architectural aesthetic sensibility and to some extent materiality of what was there before. Here is the original architect. The school is 1956, 1958. And here you see the plan. On the top, you'll see the little building in pink that was remodeled, was taken away and remodeled. But the interesting part about this was the fact that the community, in the shrinking community, meaning that the need for an elementary school was much less the case than it was in the post-war period, the community came together and decided to preserve it. And so it was a consensus development in the preservation sense, which is really, I think, the most stunning part about it. I guess it's what we call in Dutch a polder model, meaning that everybody has to agree to keep up the dike because everybody grinds. But it is that kind of consensus development that really is something that we certainly have not been able to accomplish very much. And again, a couple of images of the completed site, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And the seismic solution. You'll see the cross in the middle there is a way of giving lateral stability to the building in order to meet the seismic codes. It's a very sensitive, very nice solution that really doesn't look very intrusive in terms of the solution. So who is working here? I mean, who is really looking at modern architecture in that context? And as you all know, I'm very actively involved in Docomomo. We have chapters in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China. So it's really very much there. The other one is MAN. It's Modern Asian Architectural Network, a very loose affiliation of academics in the various countries that get together occasionally, do a preservation project, but also talk about the significance of modern architecture within their context. ICOMOS ISC, 20th century, and of course, as I mentioned before, the role of the World Monuments Fund and this Modernism at Risk program, of which the Nobel Prize is part. And so there are surveys being done. Countries are beginning to identify what that heritage is. And in the case of the school, the Hizuchi school, that was a Docomomo, Japan identified significant building at least 10 years ago. So in that sense, they are beginning to do the survey work. But the actual aspect of preservation is still something that leaves lots of struggle. These are examples of the MAN work that is being done. And then, of course, I want to return back to the discussion, which is looking at some of the charters. And I think that what's interesting, and it makes it relevant back to modern architecture, is that the introduction of the Nara Declaration, which is actually next year 20 years old, the whole discussion of authenticity, in my mind, is a discussion in preservation of modern architecture, in preservation in America, or let's say Western cultures, that something starts not until 20 years ago. I mean, it really is a fairly recent discussion. I certainly cannot remember having heard the word authenticity used in preservation context 30, 40 years ago. So there is an influence and sensibility, a sense of meaning, a sense of place that's coming up from an Eastern cultures into the preservation discussion in America. And I think it's important because if we are then looking back at modern architecture and its temporality, that meaning discussion becomes interesting again, because part of what we're talking about, is there any difference between the curtain wall and the lacquers that we saw before? I'm not trying to answer the question, but I'm sort of drawing the parallel because I think there is that part of that temporal discussion, the idea of newness and age value and all those words that we're using really apply also very much to that. The other part is the Borough Charter. This is the cover of the most recent edition that was adopted in March of this year. And again, the Borough Charter is that development of trying to recognize the intangible values. And I think that is a discussion in preservation, in modern preservation and in modern architecture preservation, that's for us still fairly recent. And I think, again, it comes out of a different cultural atmosphere, which means that cross-visualization takes place. And I was reminded of that. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian building that was never built. He designed it for Florida Southern College, but it was never built. And so the college decided to build it as a visitor center in a location that's about 60 feet or 60 meters away from what was planned for. And so all I'm showing you here is because I see the circular discussion. I'm back to the tea house in Newport. It's a reconstruction. It is a moved location, basically challenging a lot of the original principles that we've had in preservation for the last 20, 30 years, and maybe we should re-examine. You may wonder what this is. This is a typical architectural studio. You will find this all over the world. They look the same. The dimensions may change a little bit. I mean, this is I think this is Kyoto. It's a little tighter than maybe you'll find upstairs at the Avery, but so there's similarity of global architectural culture that is already there. And I think within that context, we need to look much more closely at the preservation of architecture. And then I have my own example. My book came out in 2008, Preservation of Modern Architecture. And I think the one on the left is mine in Japanese. My name is on it. I can't read anything else, but they tell me it's very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo, particularly on finishing up on the charters, which I think maybe Vincent will pick up on a little bit as well. I was struck by the image of the post office and its addition and how similar it looks to the Hearst building and the Foster addition. So our next speaker, Vincent Michael, please come to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed those last two presentations, and I hopefully will pick up on that a bit in what I do. Let's make sure I understand how to work this. I'm going to first introduce you very briefly to the work of the Global Heritage Fund in terms of its mission and methodology, and then I'm going to focus on the charters and how they've changed over time as East has met West and what that means. We have a mission to protect, preserve, and sustain the most significant and endangered cultural heritage sites in the developing world. We work primarily in the developing world, and we have a process that includes these 4 points. The most advanced conservation science, planning, which is both the site management planning you would find through World Heritage inscription, as well as community planning. Community development is an important component of what we do, and I'm going to come back to that idea. And then we also work with a variety of partners. We have a senior advisory board, some of whom are here, and we select sites based on criteria, which you can actually see on our website. The criteria, the threshold are, we look for World Heritage status or tentative list, highly endangered, and in developing countries. And then we look for projects that have both the planning needs and the conservation science needs, as well as looking in terms of their community development potential. And then these last two, partnerships, I would just point out, we look for project partnerships in 2 levels. One is the execution of a project, which for us is about 3 to 5 years. And second is who's going to take over the issue long term. And this is where we're going to come back to the ideas that the first two speakers have raised in regard to what does it mean over time? What does it mean to restore something? What does it mean to build something again? What does it mean to bring it back? Because that's always a future action. This is just where we work. Quickly through our 4 points, we try to bring in the latest conservation technology and experts, not just in conservation, but also in things like community development. Comprehensive planning for sustainable success, and partnering with a variety of groups. You can see some of the groups here: UNESCO, SCI-ARC, Prince Claus Fund out of the Netherlands. The whole idea of this is long-term sustainability, and that's the idea of community development, because if you think about the earlier examples that we looked at, whether you're allowing the temple, the lacquer temple, to deteriorate, or whether you're renewing it, somebody is undertaking that action. And who that somebody is generally the steward of the site. So as a foreign NGO, we have the issue of finding who are going to be the long-term stewards of each site and engaging them. And the way we engage them is through community development, finding some aspect of the site that will provide benefit, employment opportunity to the local community who are the ultimate stewards. Okay, so now I'd like to quickly go through a sort of brief understanding, and every presentation has shown you a Shinto temple, and I'm no exception. We, of course, begin with the Athens Charter, which talked about respecting all periods. But, of course, as we know now, the Athens Charter also said it's okay to throw concrete on things to put them back together. We updated that, of course, with Venice, which, again, told us to respect the various periods, but also stressed the importance of documentation, and in Article 12, famously asked us to distinguish the new from the old. That's a challenge, as again, referring back to the previous two presentations. And the big shift really happens, as Theo pointed out, with the Nara document on authenticity in '94. By the way, the images, that is a Shinto temple at Ise on the upper right, of course Nara on the lower right, and on the left we have the authentic, over century-old Parthenon in Nashville. In Nara, we learned about the importance of cultural diversity and intangible heritage, that cultural values help determine the treatments. And to me, this was an extremely important shift, because it shifted our authenticity discussion from a sort of static question of what are you concerned about, to a dynamic process. Preservation shifted, in a sense, from a set of rules to a process. It shifted from the product to the process, from the object to the action. A quick quote from the Nara document: "Authenticity judgments may be linked to the worth of a great variety of sources of information, which may include form and design, materials and substance, use and function, traditions and technique, location and setting, spirit and feeling." It was a move beyond form and fabric, and if you think about it in some ways, there are sort of two approaches. You think about a Shinto temple and you say, well, it's a new building, but it's rebuilt using tools and techniques that might be 1,000 years old. Whereas, as one of the earlier speakers pointed out, we might happily go into Mount Vernon with epoxy and nail guns and not feel any conflict in that. So what is the process of preservation versus the product of preservation? And then with with the Burra Charter, we saw conservation as an active process of change. In a sense, the Burra is a reaction to the modernism that was implicit in the Venice Charter. It also brought us the idea of a cultural landscape, cultural and natural significance. And most importantly for me, it moved away from universalizing standards to an idea that you engage a community in the process of identifying, evaluating, registering, and treating historic properties. That was then carried further in the last decade, especially with Xi'an, that talked about interdisciplinary coordination. It's not just the province of the solely preservation experts, and the importance of community engagement. And really that's what Global Heritage Fund tries to do. We try to create a community engagement. So if you think of preservation not as standards but process, in the United States, we, of course, have this identify, evaluate, register, and treat. In a sense, I always define preservation as a process whereby a community determines what elements of its past it wants to bring into the future and how it will bring them into the future. And that can vary by cultural. It can vary by type of resource, if you will. The other important thing that happened with the more recent documents since Burr was the idea of cultural landscapes, was a broadening from, and I'm just going to flip back for a second, a broadening from the idea of the monument, which we might see in these slides, to the idea of a landscape or a place that includes not just buildings, but also the folkways of people there, the interaction of environment, the changes to a landscape, the ongoing changes to a landscape. So we have the idea of cultural landscape, which is really a development idea, an idea of how you develop a place and preserve the elements of it that make it important. I always like identify, evaluate, register, and treat. In the primitive society, this would be, planning the hunt, catching them, cooking them, and eating them, right? And in a sense, what we've done over the course of the last almost century is move from only identifying the megafauna, the huge things, the monuments that we want to catch, cook, and eat, to looking at the entire environment and the people that live in it. So it's important for us at Global Heritage Fund, and I think for everyone involved in preservation, to think, how do you actually sustain something over time, whether it's in the deteriorated state, which may be appropriate given the cultural predispositions, or in a perfectly renewed state, which also may be appropriate given the conditions. And the key way to do that is to engage the community from the beginning in the process, in the planning process, and ask them, what do you think is important? How do you want to bring it into the future? We provide the expertise not just in the specific materials conservation elements or the specific design conservation elements, but also in the ways that you engage the economic everyday in conserving what is important in the past. So a few examples I'm going to talk about. Cultural landscapes, and I'm sorry for the character hanging over there. That was a little formatting problem. I first got involved about 10 years ago in a place in Yunnan province in China called the Weishan Heritage Valley. And this was exactly that. It was a place that consisted both of monuments, such as this national landmark. This is the North Gate. It is the second largest North Gate, or gate tower in China after Tiananmen, and it's about 13 years older than Tiananmen. So you have a historic town centered on what we call the Southern Silk Road down in Yunnan province. So the Heritage Valley includes both the town itself, which has a variety of degrees of preservation regulation, if you will, in the center, both for its traditional houses as well as for its monuments. And it also includes a nearby mountain called Weibaoshan that has 22 important Taoist and Buddhist temples. The goal of this place was very similar to the language we saw in the Burra Charter or the Xi'an Declaration, which is what is important about it. Its history, its urban life, its sacred mountain, its nature, its diverse peoples. This is the center of what is called the Yi and Wei Autonomous County, which are two groups of people who provide the majority of the population here. It also includes its productive agricultural valley. So the idea was not only to preserve the buildings, the monuments on the mountain, but also how the valley worked, the sort of farm-to-table process of food production. It sustained economic vitality and residents enhanced quality of life. This sort of models what I would call the global heritage preservation methodology, which is if we can enhance the quality of life and improve the economic conditions, we create the conditions for sustainable stewardship over time. A balance between culture, ecology, and commerce. This idea itself of a cultural heritage or cultural landscape or a heritage area arguably comes out of England and came through the United States in the 1980s as well. So you could argue that it's the West meeting the East. But at the same time, I think very strongly the East moved to the West in engaging a different understanding of preservation standards. I think the idea of preservation as a process rather than a product comes out of the East. If we can argue that the cultural landscape is something that has moved from West to East, then perhaps in 21st century conservation, we have a meeting of those two traditions. Weishan Heritage Valley concerns both its tangible and its intangible heritage and also uses preservation as a development tool. Just a couple more images. One from the other national landmark in the town is the temple behind the monk you see practicing Tai Chi there. So, a couple examples from Global Heritage Fund. I first got involved with the organization when I was still a full-time professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago through their project in Pingyao in Shanxi province in China. Pingyao is the famous walled city. It's an intact walled city. It was probably known to many people as the site for filming of the film Raise the Red Lantern, which was quite famous. It had, at the time of its World Heritage inscription, in addition to its completely intact city wall, it had over 500 traditional courtyard houses. It also had historic significance, and maybe this is something we haven't talked about as much as we've focused on design and form. As its historic significance, the origin of a draft banking system that was very important through much of East Asia in the 19th century. And they've actually created, if you will, a courtyard house museum around some of these early banking houses that provided merchants a way to transfer money from one place to another without carrying tons of silver ingots so they would be attacked by bandits. So we have those layers of significance. And part of the issue when Global Heritage Fund got involved was that many of the courtyard houses were being lost, either to development or the need to have something modern. So we did the restoration of two model courtyard houses. You see the planning director, Mr. G, on the far right with our project director, Han Li. We also worked with Tongji University to do a comprehensive city plan. And this was actually quite fascinating because when we, well, I'll get to the plan again in a second, because the plan had to be comprehensive. It couldn't just deal with cultural heritage. So we reconstructed two courtyard houses, one at this address, 12 Mi Jiexiang, and these were seen as an example. It was very interesting to me in that I've shown a detail on the left here of the yaodong. In this particular province, the rear building in a courtyard house is a yaodong, and it consists of three parabolic brick arches, which is a wonderful natural heating and cooling system. It's a climate similar to here. So you have this parabolic brick arch structure where you'd have the most elderly and senior people in a family would live there because, of course, it would be much easier to heat in the winter and it would remain much cooler in the summer as well. And the actual job we had here was to restore the courtyard, which was mostly there, but the yaodong was gone. That building was gone. And so we built it from scratch. So it's a reconstruction, a complete reconstruction from scratch. And the question I asked our project director, Han Li, I said, was that hard to do? Because I was thinking about what is the authenticity question here. And she said, no, because people still do it. And I thought, well, here's an interesting place where we haven't crossed the line between tradition and modernity that sort of underlies so much of the whole idea of historic preservation, that we've crossed this line and we somehow have to figure out what to do. So the tradition of brick construction of a yaodong still existed. So it was able to reconstruct it. So in a sense, you have something you could say, well, the rear building is inauthentic, but it's been constructed by an authentic process and an unbroken tradition. We also provided for new intangible heritage. Look at the inside on the right of the central structure of the courtyard. We created a lecture hall that is used for weekly presentations on traditional Pingyao intangible heritage, whether it's the local dialect, whether it's the puppet theater that was particular to that place, or other aspects. And these are sometimes broadcast as well. So I thought it was a wonderful example of a combination of tangible and intangible heritage in the spirit of the most recent charters. We also worked with local planning officials to do a survey and plan of the courtyards in the town, which eventually came up with this plan by Tongji. And it was interesting because, of course, what happened is we presented the plan to the cultural minister, and the cultural minister was basically freaked out by it. He was like, what do I do with this? Because it's talking about sewage and it's talking about all sorts of regular planning things. And the reality was you couldn't plan just for cultural heritage in isolation. You had to look at all city services. You had to look at all of the built fabric, all of the systems, all of the regulatory systems in order to properly plan for the cultural heritage. It couldn't be done in isolation. But this contradicted the normal silos of bureaucracy that exist. One of the few advantages you have as a foreign NGO is your ability to lay across some of the silos that separate entities. We also did a series of workshops on things like the Jianxi, the paper cutting, and woodblock printing as well. It's been a successful project. After our 2 model courtyard houses, we did a series of guidelines in Chinese for the restoration, and now the county has taken over and is actually providing grants and loans to homeowners who follow the guidelines. So the whole idea was to create a good process, a couple good models, and then let someone else carry it forward. So our stewardship model has worked. The second and final, the local government is carrying the project forward. The second and final example I'm going to tell you about is a new project in the poorest province in China, Guizhou, which is just to the east of Yunnan, and consists of the tentative list minority villages of Guizhou. And we have a series of villages. Each of them, in this case, has important tangible heritage, which our first step is, again, to bring people in and survey, often university students, survey the tangible heritage, but also important intangible cultural elements. There's a whole series of villages. They represent a variety of minority groups, including the Dong, which the first one we're working in is Dali Dong village. There actually also are a couple Han majority villages that we're working in as well. These are the wonderful traditional covered bridges of Guizhou that you see on the left. This is, as you can see, a relatively modern reconstruction again in Longda village. And what I was really struck by when I first got involved with this and went there just about 1 year ago was how good the community engagement element of the planning was. Because we have several partners, as you'll see in a future slide in this project, including UNESCO's Beijing office, including the culture ministry at both the provincial level and a special cultural unit at the local level, both Tongji and Beidao Peking universities, and a Chinese NGO called Youcheng, which focuses on intangible heritage conservation. And it was interesting because in these early planning meetings, there was sort of a approach that was not assuming what would be preserved, but asking the community. So, for example, we were in Heshui village, which makes traditional paper, and we asked them, do you want to keep making the paper? Is this something people really want to do? Doesn't this younger generation just want to go move to the big city and go to the disco? And they were like, no, there's actually interest in preserving the paper tradition. So what's the problem? The problem is it produces about 1/3 of the income that's needed to sustain it. So then the questions became, well, what is the quality of this paper versus other types of paper that can be found in the region? You have one calligrapher up in Hunan who is ordering it. Is anyone else ordering it? How are you marketing it? What is the business plan? And those are really the important elements of the planning in that regard. And I was impressed by how our partners were not imposing a solution, but really engaging the community in the process. We will work with the conservation of traditional structures, both architectural, as you can see on the right, and also things like this wonderful water wheel that is used to mash the mulberry bark to make the paper in Heshui village. We're partners, as I said, with UNESCO, the Culture Ministry, Tongji and Peking universities, and Youcheng. Youcheng is a relatively new Chinese NGO, and they've worked in a variety of areas. And again, the idea is not to preserve handicrafts in the sort of, what I would argue is sort of 80-year-old sense of, oh, sell trinkets to the tourists. It's much more, how can we bring this into the modern economic everyday? How can we find the markets that might exist for this high-quality handmade paper, or this high-quality silversmithing, or the other particular crafts that are indigenous, if you will, to each village, or, in most cases, about 600 years old. So the community development really is business planning for traditional production. We also will do, as we have done and as other groups like World Monuments Fund do, conservation training, but that's not the entirety of the model. So preservation here is a place-based process, and it's very much a planning process. And I stress the aspect of process because we're not coming in saying these are the particular elements that must be preserved, but we're engaging the community into determining which elements are important. We not only do training in the conservation of individual structures, but we also train local planning officials in the survey techniques. And as I said, we work with our partners to help preserve traditional processes and crafts. So really, in conclusion, I would argue that modern conservation not only combines tangible and intangible heritage, but sees preservation as a process. Our model, we think, takes advantage of the economic potential of modern conservation. And this is something that I'm relatively new to the organization. I've been there a couple of years full-time. But it's something that I think, as a model that was first invented, we're a young organization from 2002, is something that's been recognized now. If you look at many of the recent papers over the last 2 or 3 years, UNESCO wrote The Power of Culture for Development. ICOMOS had, of course, the following year, the Paris Declaration on Heritage as a Driver of Development. And while many of us might think, oh gosh, preservation is sort of against development, in a sense, preservation is also always, in fact, a development choice. It's a type of development. And if it's done with community engagement, it's going to be successful and sustainable over the long term because you've created the steward for that site. Often people will say, well, why are you're just adding community development to what you do because it seems to be more people might like or more people might want to fund community development than heritage conservation. No, the reality is if you think back to the earlier slides, that all the money in the world dumped into a site, everything deteriorates over time. Even if you put the temple inside a box, there will be some need to preserve it. You have to preserve the Mona Lisa even in the controlled environment of the Louvre. So consequently, the most important element in any preservation decision in terms of sustainability is finding how to get renewed investment in a site over time. Who is going to continue to invest, restore, reconstruct, or whatever the decision might be that is culturally appropriate over time. And the way to do that is to understand heritage as a development process, culture as the fourth pillar of sustainability, along with economic, social, and environmental. So heritage can only be sustained in the long term if it is part of the economy of a community. That's what we try to do at Global Heritage Fund. I'm proud to do it because I think it's a culmination in many ways of a scholarly career that has included historic preservation and heritage areas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, heritage as a driver for development, preservation as a development choice. That's something I think we will have some comments about. Our next speaker, Lee Ambrozy from NYU. Lee, please come to the podium.
That's excellent. I'm very happy to follow up on your talk because I'm here to talk also about what I think is a type of monumentality that's defined by a tangible space, but also in part by the activities that transpire there. In the case of the Shaanxi Valley, which lies very close to some of the sites you just discussed in Yunnan province. So I'm not a specialist in historic preservation. I just want to preface that I have a background in sociology and I'm now studying art history, and I lived for a long time in China. So I think a lot of the views here are informed by that experience. I also lived in a rural town very close to Pingyao for a year, which you also discussed. So I've seen a lot of these sites develop over time and traveled to a lot of them. So I want to discuss a little bit what has been considered a model historic preservation site in China. It's the Shaanxi Valley in Yunnan province. It lies in southwestern China. I think some of us may have been there. And I think it's very ideal to discuss this particular site at this moment because it's sort of wrought with this sense of urgency. And I think we all know what that means when we think about the approaching tourism that is inherent in all of these preservation issues. So the valley is currently threatened by the speed of infrastructure development and this inevitable looming wave of tourism. And I think this is a danger to all sites in China, especially in rural sites where there's certain disparities. So here's the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll just contextualize the historical, cultural, political, socio-economic situation in the valley and introduce the Shaanxi Rehabilitation Project, which effectively triangulates the populations and the interests that converge in Shaanxi. I'll also identify the goals, the methodology, and the values engaged by the SRP's international team of preservationists that work there, and pay special attention to how they're interacting with the local leadership and the minority population that lives there. I'll also try to gauge the project's successes to date and identify some of the challenges that they face in working there and reaching some of their benchmark goals. And we'll identify the outcomes the first several years of restoration because they've been working there since 2002. And then I hope we can critically examine the preservation strategies here and maybe identify a new set of needs that's emerged. And ultimately, in the spirit of today's colloquium, I think we can ask, are there East-West interests converging here? How are those playing out in this context? So first, let's get very macro here. I want to talk about China in general. So here you see the site on the map. It lies close to Burma. It's very close to Tibet. Archaeology suggests that there's been a population here since prehistoric times. They may have had a Bronze Age, which is very interesting. And settlements here have connected China and India since they think maybe 100 BC. So there's a lot of history here that has yet to be explored. The climax of exchange and trade happened during the Nanzhao period, which was the 8th to 10th century, and also in the Dali Guo, or the Dali Kingdom, which was the 10th to the 13th century. So here we're closing in on the valley. The Hengduan Mountains are to the west as well as Burma. So here's a very close-up of the valley that is protected. Here we call the Shaanxi Valley, and this is what it looks like in geographical terms. So the Shaanxi Valley lies on the historic Tea-Horse Caravan Trail, which is between two major cities, Dali and Lijiang. Here's a map of the Tea-Horse Trail, and I think this is where Shaanxi lies on the map. So this is Lijiang and this is Dali. This caravan trail has been active for about 600-700 years since the Tang Dynasty, and it was active all the way up until the early 1950s. It linked Tibet and southwest China. They were taking horses from Tibet, and tea. Yunnan is a producer of pu'er cha or pu'er tea that we all know very well. So these were treasured commodities or trading back and forth. And in the spirit of China's classic triumvirate of trade, I want to, tea, silk, and porcelain. I'll show you a photograph here of people on the trail, and this is how they used to pack the cakes of tea and carry them tons on their back at one time, and they would travel through these incredibly high mountainous regions. So it was very treacherous, it was dangerous, the altitudes, the weather, it's almost lucky that this is not the primary mode of transportation anymore. And then here on the right-hand side is an artwork by Ai Weiwei. It's a ton of tea, pu'er cha, right here, just sort of showing how tea continues to frame the way that we see China and interpret it. So it's a very essential part of our understanding of China. There's also been a long history of artists in this region of China. So in Japan occupied China and during its civil war, this area in Yunnan housed many artists and sometimes entire academies who fled occupied territories, including Xubei Hong, was stationed here for years during the war. So some of the elders living along the trail still remember when the tea-horse caravan would move through town carrying these loads on their backs. And after 1949, massive infrastructure developments included the construction of highways, which diverted trade away from the Shaanxi Valley. And outward migration and Shaanxi's remote location all contributed to its economic decay. Forced collectivization later changed economic practices, and the trail gradually fell out of use. We could say that the motorbike has effectively replaced this trail as a primary means of transportation. So despite the fact that the trail itself is no longer an artery for trade, its midpoint position between Dali and Lijiang contributes to its potential for tourism, as these are two of the most active tourist sites in China. It's also home, it's in the heartland of the Bai Autonomous Region, which has the highest concentration of the Bai people in China. More than 90% of the population here is Bai. This includes the local government, which I think is very interesting and important for our purposes of thinking how preservationists are working with them. The valley is home to syncretic religious practices which absorb influences from Indian Buddhism, Taoism, animism, Tibetan cosmologies, and they say there's even Persian Zoroastrianism here. So a lot of interesting things are converging via the history of the Tea-Horse Caravan Trail. And interestingly, the site is ideally located for a project of architectural preservation. So here's a shrine, one of the local shrines. So the Shaanxi Valley is known for its artisan woodwork. The area literally exports woodworkers and maintains a robust tradition of apprentice master craftsmanship. The richness of the Bai-minority architectural traditions can be evidenced in local courtyard houses that cover this area of Yunnan. So here's one example of contemporary Bai architecture here. The Shaanxi Valley is very poor. They're primarily a society based on subsistence agriculture. They have small surpluses of corn, squash, other vegetables that they will sell at market for market-based trade. And in addition to this, there's an incredible variety of mushrooms that grow in the mountains, in the foothills. Some of which, including the songrong mushroom, can be sold for very high returns. So locals use this knowledge to forage for profit. So let's look at the larger context of tourism in the region. Many populations have a stake in the development here. The southwest Yunnan area has exploded in popularity since China opened up to domestic tourism, and phenomena such as the Golden Weeks, which is an enforced week of tourism, has stimulated domestic travel within China. And neighboring Lijiang, which you see here in these two photographs, is frequently cited as an area that has been ravaged by tourism, where overwhelming presence of tour groups in the old town have hindered the ability to appreciate it or enjoy it. I think in Dali also, the presence of so many tourists makes walking on the streets actually problematic. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been there, but sometimes you can't actually walk on the streets in the old town because there's just too many people. Yeah. So, what do we have next here? Dali also is a place where a lot of urbanites choose to seek a site of refuge. They like to escape, find biodiversity, enjoy the lakes, breathe fresh air. So this, in effect, has led to the destruction of the very thing that people are seeking, because the speed of development is so fast that things like mountains are being carved away. I was in Dali for 10 days. I had climbed up the mountain on one day into the Changshan, because you have to find a route up the mountain. I went back 3 days later and it was gone. The mountain was gone. It was pretty incredible. And there was a group of men there mining earth or something because they were building a high-rise tower off in the mountains, close to the mountains, with views of the lake. So this is definitely a very present danger, and it's moving very quickly, which is what I mean by a sense of urgency. There's lots of foreign populations converging here, including tourists that travel here and people who have relocated permanently or take up long-term projects in the area. So this brings us to the chassis rehabilitation project and the discovery of chassis, which happened by, this is the discovery narrative as I've understood it. So it happened by two very intrepid explorers who in 2001, Jacques Feynman, who is a Swiss urban planner, and Mi Xiwen, who was also traveling with him, they were visiting other sites in the region, and they happened to spot the town in the valley from a site above. And they thought it looked interesting, so they got a guide to take them down there and show them around. Initially, it was not on their itinerary. They were deterred from visiting, but they thought it looked interesting. So once they arrived in Sidung village, which is at the very center of the valley, they were drawn in by the square. The Chassis government invited them to share their experiences with preservation, share their knowledge, and of course, realizing the valuable history of the site and seeing the opportunity to protect it, they wrote up an emergency plan to add the site to the list of the WMF's list of endangered sites. And I think within a matter of weeks, they were added to the list. In 2002, it became one of the WMF 100 most endangered sites. So in the years to come, Feynman, with the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, organized the Chassis Rehabilitation Project, which included working with local officials to create a steering group and then begin implementing a plan. And both sides had raised funds from the beginning. So I think a substantial part of the monumentality here is characterized by the market life. I haven't shown you a picture of the square yet, but we'll get to it. They had also recognized this in their plan. They intended not only to restore and protect the physical traces of the marketplace, but to revitalize the economy that it symbolized. And it is a tradition in these areas for people living in the hill villages to come down for Friday market, carrying their goods in baskets worn on their back, called the lolo, which you see here. So not only was poverty elimination or alleviation a strategic goal of the project, I think that we could also consider the market tradition, or the ganji, as a kind of intangible cultural heritage. I think the Friday market that happens here is also a big draw. It's an exciting thing and very charming. So here's the goals of the project. To preserve the structural and natural heritage of Sidung, salvage the environment, the framework of history, and protect the ecosystem. To expand it as a model for sustainable development, emphasize the integral role of Chassis local leadership, and establish local governance, and encourage responsible practices, showcase primary historic structures to demonstrate value and the potential lure of tourism, revive local building traditions. They also wanted to devise strategies of indigenous growth and cultural capital, and lure outside investment while ensuring local returns. So the goals had a 6-module implementation strategy, which included first the marketplace restoration, to revise the market square, restore the old caravan stop, historic village preservation, which was to work out a preservation and development plan for Sidung village, sustainable valley development, to build sustainable tourism, integrating the cultural landscape, structural landmarks, and other villages into a comprehensive plan. And ecological sanitation and waste management, there was a huge lack of infrastructure, including no public wastewater treatment plants or public restrooms. Poverty alleviation, training, they had planned training focusing on ecotourism. And then finally, the dissemination of this experience that they hoped could be shared with other regions and initiatives within Greater China as well as in the area. So this preservation philosophy was implemented by a historic preservationist and an architect in China whose name is Huang Yinwu, who graduated from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, 2003. He also later earned a master's in conservation from Hong Kong University in 2006. So he presided over all of the restoration since 2003, working on the ground there for, I think, 8 years he was there. He did everything. And he was generous to have multiple phone interviews with me over the past couple of weeks. So we talked a lot about, are there East and West differences in conservation, to which he staunchly denies. He does not believe that is true. He says there's many schools of preservation in China, but it's particular factors, including investors and local leadership, that determine the outcome of any project. He's also done a lot of speaking and writing on values of conservation and historic preservation in the context of the chassis work that he does. And he defines historical relic as something that has accumulated value, historic, cultural, social, and scientific. So these values cannot be reproduced or replicated. And he sees architectural preservation as a living tradition where authenticity includes local craftsmanship. He also believes that conservation workers, when they confront cultural heritage, they should respect the complex cultural information that it contains and strive to make only modest changes. Huang advocates his modest approach as not only useful for historic preservation, but he believes that it's just as important for contemporary cities and architecture when they're doing their urban planning. So what types of values are we engaging here? And I think in the following photos, before-after photos, we can see that the restorers working here are clearly upholding age value of the monuments. They're attempting to preserve historical authenticity, even if that includes the preservation of complex political pasts, and they're layering the visible history on the square. The treatments themselves, they strive for invisibility, reversibility. They're using original materials whenever possible and local labor. They prefer minimal intervention to complete replacement, even if it is less cost-effective. And they only made invasive interventions in the case of structural collapse. There was also a lean towards green or environmentally sustainable processes, including materials that might potentially deteriorate, to which some architects have criticized, wondering why you wouldn't choose to use something that would last longer, to which Huang replies that these too can be replaced, and that would be involving the local community of labor, which is something that he finds important. So I would also argue that in a place like Chassis, it's important to protect its ability to be discovered. So I think there's a type of discovery value here that when we visit or when we live there, we want to feel like there's something of the sort of original atmosphere, the quiet and the remote nature of the site that should also be preserved. So this is a plan of the market square in which 6 centuries of transition are visible. The square features red sandstone paving, entrance gates, which would be closed at night to help guard the square from bandits. They rebuilt the gates leading to the square, and commerce had circled it in wooden front stores. Courtyard houses were on the neighboring streets. There also includes guest accommodations, such as the Lao Ma Dian that opened right on the square. And the visual climax of the square happens here with the theater complex, and on top of that you have a Kuising Lo, or a Kuising pavilion, which has a local god and is very interesting. So here, this is the before photograph. It was largely abandoned. It's a mid-Qing dynasty building, and it was restored to its late Qing incarnation. It's one of the best surviving examples in China today of this type of theater. So here's a look at the after. You can see they changed the power lines. They repaved in a lot of areas. This is the post. But this is not the most recent incarnation of this particular area. Here you have some slogans that they opted to keep very visible in the center of the square because it was a part of the authentic layers. They didn't whitewash these. I thought that was an interesting decision. And here you have the rebuilt inner south gate. And this is the south gate before Reconstruction. And this is after Reconstruction. So it still maintains a lot of the very old look. It's very hard, I think, if you had no clue of the history here, you maybe wouldn't notice that it had been restored. So here's the theater again, and I want to look at the inside that they had been repainted to uphold the Qing Dynasty style. Of course, all done by local craftsmen. So inside of the theater, they had built a museum on the second floor. Huang's philosophy on repurposing the space as a museum was not to force anything, but to strive for adaptation instead. So when they realized the structure would only allow for a 1.65 meter high ceiling, which is about this high, they knew it wouldn't be enough to accommodate most people in the space, but they still chose not to elevate the beams or change the structure of the space. Instead, they attempted to change people's behavior by adding large fields of like bright reflective light so that you wouldn't hit the beams when you entered the space. So the next major structural feature on the square is the Xingjiao Temple, which was built in the early Ming Dynasty in 1415. It was built by Azhali Buddhists who practiced a form of Vajrayana Buddhism that was transmitted from India to the kingdom of Dali. In this interesting practice, the monks have families, they eat meat and they drink wine, so it's a very interesting and very small sect of Buddhism. During the Guangxu reign, here I'll show you this, which was 1875 to 1908, guardian kings were put at the entrance of the Xingjiao Temple, and this is the period that they reflected in the restoration. Later, arson by bandits in the Republican era damaged the guardian kings and they were removed. And the site was later turned into a city hall. So there was a lot of issues in how to reconstruct this space. The crossbeams on the temple apparently were not matching up. There was a lot of structural problems. And the team could have replaced the beams in their entirety, but this would have caused the loss of certain historical bits of information, according to Huang's philosophy. So he took the very strict heritage preservation point of view and created small pieces of wood that were inserted in parts of the joints so that they would be structurally sound but still maintain the overall materials. He said that when he was working with the local architects or the local craftsmen, they were baffled by the philosophy. They just didn't understand why you'd want to spend more money and time on something that could have been easily replaced. But in the end, he did convince them of his ways. The temple also features, here's the inner courtyard. It features an interesting cycle of murals. Here's another photograph of the outside temples, the restoration that they had done. This is before and after, so the changes are very minimal. I'll show you before again. You can see they removed some of the paint on the pillars. And they cleaned up the doors, and they're all functioning. It's a very nice space. So inside, you have an interesting cycle of murals that surrounds the inner temple. These were painted by a minority painter, also in the Ming Dynasty, whose name is recorded as Zhang Bao. So this is a very fascinating piece of art historical information that I, for one, would love to look more into. But what is happening here with these representations of deities, we don't know. They're very obscured and dirty. There was a couple cases of arson, and also apparently in the 70s, some of the murals had been chalked out. So there was, you can see the inside, the 5 Buddhists. So here's an example of one of the murals that was restored by a team of Romanian conservation experts who were brought in to the Swiss party to redo the murals. They did 2, and this was another one. So you can see the before and after photographs. When I asked Huang why they were not continuing this type of work, he said it was just cost prohibitive. They didn't have the money to continue. And they didn't want to bring in anyone less than the very best specialists to work on these, so they would rather just leave them how they are for now. So the final example is the Lao Ma Dian, a guest house that lies right on the courtyard. This is the facade before restoration, and this is after. This is the courtyard inside before, and that is after. So all these photographs were provided to me by Huang. This is their work. So I would like to gauge, this is one final building, a structural collapse in which they had taken a much more dramatic intervention, and this is the final product. So I'd like to gauge the project successes to date. The historic square, it's protected. The Friday market has returned. The guardian kings were repositioned outside the temple, which has resumed its function as a center of village ceremony. Long abandoned shops reopened in the market square, and sanitary conditions were introduced through eco-friendly means. So in the process of working, the team inventoried all the buildings in the village. All the buildings were surveyed, even if they were not restored. Specialists created a plan for future restoration of individual houses, which would provide aesthetic unity in the case that other people would want to fix up their house. They would have the availability of plans and the like. The local government took the initiative to purchase selected buildings for public use, including the tower for the museum, and local craftsmen were contracted to carry out restoration projects. In some instances, local craftsmen had actually revived techniques that had been lost, which was an extra bonus for them. So the SRP had set a technical and a social benchmark for conservation in this region of southwest China, and it acted as a catalyst for local preservation activity. In 2005, it was awarded a UNESCO award for cultural heritage conservation, and here you see them sort of celebrating the opening of the square in 2004. So here is the square today. We know that in the later phases, poverty alleviation and cultural conservation have become much more important tasks, although not all of these have been as successful. Ecological sanitation, waste management, these seem to be working out relatively well, although people who are owning shops in the region are telling me that some of the eco policies are not being enforced. The locals don't quite understand the purpose of a recycling bin, for instance. So if you have a row of recycling bins, then there'll be all kinds of trash outside. So there's obviously some sort of disparity of that type of understanding. Poverty alleviation is obviously an important goal, but how much of these opportunities are trickling down to the locals? So according to Huang's interpretation, he thinks that locals see this approaching wave of tourism, and they're more interested in the quick returns than they are interested in making long-term investments that would lead to the sustainability of the site. I think the question on the minds of other architects and historic preservationists in China is whether or not this project can be replicated in other places, or was this a one-off project? One architect writing in a piece online who was commenting on Huang's work, he lamented the fact that he had never come across this ideal, perfect job with ideal funders. He said, who wouldn't be such a great architect if we didn't have this type of funding? And he doubts that this type of project can be duplicated in other places, especially considering investors' ambitions and the relative strength of local governments where more local interests are at stake. So I think when we see the Shaanxi Valley, this is an instance where the local government is relatively weak in terms of organization, and in terms of their initiatives are very few. There's a lot of challenges and draws to working in Shaanxi. It's still very far from rapid urbanization in China. This could be one of its greatest assets. The Bai minority here, they're stewards of the last vestiges of a largely undocumented history of the tea horse caravan trail. But further architecture and historic residents are threatened with destruction, and there's obviously a need for more coherent plans for future development. And this was noted in the most recent phase of the SRP, which lasted from 2011 to 2012, the main goal of this was to revise the master plan and elaborate on specific strategies to balance the increased traffic with the still developing infrastructure. But of course, I think the main issue in this project is the lack of public funds, which have now sort of been overtaken and usurped by private interests. So Sidong Market Square may have been rescued from destruction, but new threats have arisen. Here is one instance of, this is the stream that runs through the town, which is, I think some of the shop owners had been complaining, saying that you're not allowed to dump cleaners in here, but a lot of people are using it for the waste of like animal products, so they're having some problems keeping it clean. Here's a scene. This is an interesting local innovation. So I had been in contact with Jeff Fuchs, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He was the first documented Westerner to travel the Tea Horse Trail a couple years ago, and he had written a book on it. We were exchanging emails about how he saw the development of the town because he's through there several times every year. He thinks that many people that formerly lived in Dali with small businesses now look to Shaanxi as sort of the next big thing or the next frontier. And they're moving their businesses to Shaanxi. So who are these people? This is an interesting question for our site and for sustainability of local cultural practices. So a recent article in the New York Times in the global business section had focused on some of these people who are running boutique hotels in the rural parts of China, two which were in this particular region. So in one case you have Julien Minet, who is an ethnologist who's had a bed and breakfast in Anhui province, which is in a town which also has UNESCO status. And he's been running his site for 14 years. Outside of Dali, about 25 minutes from Dali, and also very close to this site, you have a family, the Linden family, that runs the, maybe you know them, they run the Linden Center. They're gallerists from Chicago, and their staying at their hotel includes a sort of a set of cultural interactions that are brokered within their space, which is also a beautifully restored historic monument. But I think a lot of critics say that this is very far from an authentic picture of China, and it's also not an authentic culture. I think this is what critics are telling me on the Chinese side. We also have Chris Barclay, who works in Shaanxi and was included in the article, and he is one of the most important people to the development of Shaanxi, as we will see. So in addition to the foreigners, you have an increasing group of Han Chinese who have relocated to towns like Shaanxi. There's Taiwanese restaurateurs in town. There's also, this is not a photograph of her, but there's a book bar that's owned by a very interesting single mother woman who left her urban life, relocated in Shaanxi with her son, and now she runs a bar where you can go and read books. I mean, it's an interesting cultural phenomenon that is transpiring in Shaanxi. in addition to the foreign investments. But where does this, of course, leave locals in this sort of development strategy? So the Old Theater Inn I want to talk about, because Chris Barclay, who was mentioned in the article in the New York Times, he is now the proprietor of this hotel. The Old Theater Inn, which was formerly the Dragonfly Inn, was initially restored by the Chassis Rehabilitation Project. And it had a brief stint as a community center for the local Bai people. After that, it was leased to a local Bai who turned it into a guest house. And he determined he was not so successful at running a guest house, so he leased the space to Chris, who refurbished the space. He turned it into a boutique hotel, and he turned a website into what has now become essentially the primary place to find information on Chassis. It's the only sort of outside place that you can learn about Chassis online, because the town itself has no cohesive outreach. So he runs also a society called the Ginkgo Society, and it's run out of Dali, and they run a lot of conservation efforts on their own. So they've taken a nearby temple called the Pear Orchard Temple, which was also initially slotted by the SRP for restoration, but was never followed through because of lack of funding. So he has leased that space from the town, and he's refurbishing it into a guest house, a restaurant, and a community center, through which he plans to promote activities such as horseback riding along the T-Horse Road and other activities in the valley that he believes are a benefit to local people and low impact on the environment. So in an email he said to me, he said, "You're correct to say that I am taking initiative because the government should build and run the visitor center, but they think I can do better." So I think this indicates on behalf of the government either a lack of enthusiasm or a lack of desire to compete with him. As I said before, the involvement of the government here is very weak, and even Barclay thinks that without a more enlightened government, that the area runs the risk of being completely overrun by non-locals. So are there culture clashes between East and West people in Chassis? Barclay believes that it's generally a harmonious situation. He thinks he knows how to deal with local governments. And Huang, the architect Huang Yinwu, says that their two areas of work are generally very separate. They have almost no interaction with each other. So Chris's agenda for restoration and conservation has almost nothing to do with Huang and the Chassis Rehabilitation Project. But I will note that there is a Milanese pizza maker in town who opened a pizza shop who's caused a lot of ruckus with the locals, and was actually, he told me he was threatened to spend a couple days in prison if he continued making pizza in his semi-licensed, like 9-person store in town. So I think that there's definitely a growing antagonism here. This is the inside of the Old Theater Inn. It's restored to now. And this is the theater that is in the courtyard there. So is tourism threat or is it opportunity? I think regardless of what we might think about who is developing the sites, protecting economic opportunity for locals should be an absolutely essential part of the rehabilitation process. Or it will become, as it's been described, a place with no locals and no heritage. Tourism management is needed to slow and prevent the physical stress on sites, the encroachment of infrastructure development, and air and noise pollution from increased traffic. So how do we balance the conservation of intangible cultural heritage while promoting indigenous sustainable development? How do we protect the intimacy and the quiet authenticity that lend to this sense of discovery that we so value in sites like Chassis, and which make it so unique? I think it's clear that there's disparities between the populations that are converging in Chassis, but I'm not quite sure that we could characterize them as east-west disparities. I might characterize them as urban-rural issues. The local population obviously has no understanding of how the market works. They have a lack of experience dealing with tourists, and they don't know how to reach out. And there's capital wealth issue. I mean, they had planned a micro lending program which never took off the ground for various reasons. I think there's an issue of exclusionary pricing that creates differences in the local and visiting populations. I've heard feedback from several people that the locals have no knowledge of land value appreciation, or tourist development strategy, so that a lot of them were quickly gentrified out of the market by people who spotted potential early on and leased lands for long amounts of time. So experienced planners obviously need to work closer with locals, and this might include investors to create sustainable solutions and build sustainable local economies that can help support culture, intangible and non. I was trying to think of some recommendations that might help to alleviate this type of thing. I'm sure that all of you have much more experience than I do. But maybe a co-op board of local citizens, maybe channeling funding into projects that can contribute to heritage preservation, or maybe bringing sociologists that could help do a more informed needs assessment. Because I think the architects that I had spoken with, they didn't have any experience doing needs assessment with the locals. They were definitely concerned about local populations, but they didn't know how to embed and understand. Maybe training for certain locals that could help broker and mediate exchanges with tourists. Or maybe emergency legislation is needed to monitor what types of tourist services can be allowed on the site and preserve its attractiveness to locals. There needs to be a structure to enforce and follow up on the policies that have already been set. In some regions of China, such as the Anhui province, historic towns such as Xidi and Hongcun, which are nearby Huangshan and are also UNESCO heritage sites, they charge an entrance fee to come into the city. So if you were to enter, you would pay about $16 or $17, and that's a fee that's the same for everybody visiting. Maybe this is an option for the town. Huang did not say that that was being considered by the local government, which in some senses seems to have checked out a little bit in terms of this process and how it will be developing. I would like to also contextualize this project with a rural reconstruction movement that I also see happening in China with intellectuals such as Oning, maybe you've heard of, and Zuo Jing. These are people who are interested. They're interested in preserving intangible cultural heritage, and they're pretty much anti-rural travel. They're more interested in fostering rural reconstruction, is what they're calling it, rural reconstruction. And they're against this type of sanitized village life that you would see in places like Xidi or Hongcun, where you would pay the entrance fee to get in. So they've instead taken up traditions of rural reconstruction that were first pioneered in the 1920s by the Princeton-educated YC James Yen and also Liang Qichao, whose son was the first person to do architectural preservation in China as well. So Oning and Zuo Jing have established what they call the Bishan Commune, which is located also in Anhui province, and here they've held some academic panels, they've held art shows very similar to the Pingyao Photography Festival, where they involve locals and they involve outside artists to come and work together. And Oning himself is no stranger to issues of gentrification. He made a film early in his career called the Sayunli Film Project, in which he specifically was trying to identify an Asian urbanization model by focusing on the village of Sayunli, which was a village inside of Guangzhou that had been completely enveloped by the city of Guangzhou. He also served as artistic director for the 2009 Shenzhen and Hong Kong Bi-City Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism. So this is a new type of person interested in the conversation of rural reconstruction and architectural preservation. So to summarize, in the case of the Shaxi Valley, One half of its value as a monument lies in the activities that transpire there. The conservation and preservation efforts thus far have protected material culture, but the lack of serious legislation and perhaps opening too quickly to an overwhelming market has threatened the way of life. If we want to enjoy such sites in the future, protecting opportunities for the growth of indigenous culture must be a priority. Despite however utopic that wish might be, it's something to look for in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So I'd like to invite the speakers to the table and to have Ann take over and guide us through the next part of the process. I also wanted just to thank the speakers for how well you all fit together, for which I can take absolutely no responsibility. So thank you. I think the flow was quite good. So Ann?
One of us has to stand.
Great.
Yeah. Perfect. It's musical chairs, right? Do you want this or do you want
Yes, I do. Thank you.
All right.
So are all those microphones on? I will assume they are, right? You want to give them a little tap and make sure they're on? Perfect. Okay, good. Thank you very much. As George said, I'm Ann Van Ingen, and I'm very happy to be here today. I am, my current life, I'm chairman of the board of the Preservation League of New York State. Before that, I worked for almost 30 years for the New York State Council on the Arts, running all of the design, construction, and historic preservation funding that we did. So my world, my professional life is focused on upstate New York and New York City and the issues that swirl around that. And I think all of us who work in areas that maybe aren't emerging worlds or eastern parts of the planet can learn a lot from today. Upstate New York could benefit a lot from a lot of the conversation that happened this morning. And I was, most importantly actually for today, I was a student here at Columbia. I have my historic preservation degree. I won't tell you when it came, but I was a student of Teo's and of Norman's and of Dr. Fitch, and it is a proud badge I carry. So thank you all for asking me to be here today. I appreciate it and am flattered. And I want to make sure that all the students who are here today make sure that you know, I'm sure you do know, that what the purpose of today is to give you an opportunity to meet some of the brightest minds working in our field today, and to take this opportunity to really engage and to talk to them and to ask questions, because it would be really simple for me to just have a conversation with the five of us or some of the faculty in the room. That's not the point. The point is for all of you who are students to ask the questions and to trigger conversation here today. This is very much part of what the Columbia program can give you. So do not be shy. I'm not. So what I will do is simply start by lobbing a couple of softball questions, which I think we can dispense with fairly quickly, and then open it up to the rest of you for a broader conversation, or to ask more specific questions of any and all of our speakers. So my first question for all of you was, or any of you, was the notion that came up while I was sitting here, realizing that if you look at this at the 50,000-foot view, and you start thinking about what's the role of a professional preservationist, I'm thinking that perhaps the most important thing we do, and most important thing we need to understand, no matter whether we're dealing with a restoration project that's happening within a Western context or one that's happening within an Eastern context, is to understand the cultural impulses that created that place, no matter where that place is, no matter who is sitting around the table. But the most important thing, perhaps, is to understand the cultural impulse that created it in the first place, and from there, from that understanding, build the restoration project. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Anybody want to add to that?
Well, I'll just say a couple things. I think it is a fair statement, and it's something that did resonate through all the presentations, because the idea is, you know, it resonates with authenticity. In other words, what is the authentic cultural impulse that led to the creation of the place, either its tangible or intangible form. And I think it's a good question because, in some cases it's hard to understand that. In some cases, even in the place, it's hard for the people who are there to understand it because their impulses might be more recent or they might have been inflected or deflected over time.
And I suspect it's gotten more complicated, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, as cultures are washing across each other in a fairly regular process. So we're understanding what really the purpose of this is. It's almost, as time goes by, and I think fairly quickly, this whole question is it an Eastern impulse to preservation or is it a Western impulse to preservation? I'm guessing that in 5 or 10 years, we're not going to be asking that question. It won't matter anymore, right?
I was just telling Lee there, we both mentioned I don't know if I mentioned it, but Dali in Yunnan, which is the other big tourist place besides Lijiang, actually has 2 layers of tourism. One is sort of the backpacking Westerners who came through and could only stay on one street initially in the 80s. And that now has a big gate that's, overseas foreigner street. And the local domestic tourists come there, both because an important 1959 film was made in that town, but they also come to look at the Western tourists.
Right.
So you have this sort of dual East-West gaze going on in this place every day.
It's like the zoo, who's in, who's out.
Yeah.
Or I think when you think of a place like the pizzeria that opened in Chassis, I think that he never had any intention of serving pizza to hungry Westerners on the Tea-Horse Trail. I think it was really for Chinese people who wanted to eat exotic food at a tourist destination. And he was very clear about that.
It's happening, I suspect, in both directions, too. I was in Venice last year, and there were moments when you literally couldn't walk through St. Mark's Square because it was full of very large groups of traveling Chinese individuals, people who, as private wealth has increased, individual wealth has increased in China, the Chinese want to see the world too. So it's happening in both directions. And maybe the next topic of a Fitch Colloquium could be exactly how Lee wrapped up your conversation was, what do we do about this? What do we do with these what are turning out to be victims of success? How do we manage that? However, back to the topic. Another question that came up and has more is on a smaller grain, but a really important one when we talk about how to carry out preservation is very clear. Many of you very clearly spoke to the importance of working with local partners. How do you find those partners? And I'm not talking about regional NGOs or local governments. The really important people are the people who show up for the volunteers who show up for meetings on Thursday night. It's like the planning board here in our communities in this country. Those are the people who shape change in our communities. How do you find those in foreign countries, where there are issues of culture and language barriers and all of that? So how do you go about doing that?
I mean, in some cases with the work at Global Heritage Fund, there's usually a key planning official at the local level who's very important, but I find that you actually have to hit at 2 levels. If you're dealing with government bureaucracy, you sort of have to always deal with a provincial level or something that gives the permission or the instruction to the local level. But then you actually have to develop the working relationship at the local level. Now that's government. In terms of individuals and citizens, that's more of a challenge, and it really depends on how well, in our case, certainly in China, the local bureaucrats are networked into the community.
Anybody else? Is there a tradition in China or Japan of sort of the volunteer civic core that exists in this country so strongly?
Less than.
Well, I don't know. I think there's definitely like civic spirit, which you see a lot of in cities, for instance, in terms of like keeping an area clean. You often see people in Beijing wearing armbands because they represent the neighborhood watch, and they're out every day, and you can talk to them, and they know what's happening, and they can distinguish locals from non. So there's definitely civic involvement in larger places, but I think in rural areas, which is why I have to stress that whole case study was very much a rural case, that there's been so much outward migration that there's a lack of generational integrity. So you get a lot of old people in rural places, but there's not a lot of younger folks to contribute to the more active part, which you're speaking of being a volunteer, showing up, or trying to enforce change in some way.
Right.
So we have spoken about this culture of lacquering and maintaining lacquering
Right.
in the cyclical renewal in Japan. And this is something that is presently done by highly specialized companies who do this. But I was this summer in Japan and visited a shrine that is in big trouble because they don't have the funding, and they are tied over centuries to a community of local craftsmen that used to maintain the shrine. So this is an entirely local thing, and this is also, of course, a very local identity they want to maintain, and they are struggling how to meet the needs of their buildings, of their institution, and at the same time of the local community, of the parish in a way that used to be connected to this shrine. So I think that's something one has to account for.
It's funny, I was listening and thinking back that it reminded me actually of post-World War II Europe, where there comes a stage in the development where the preservation of the craft becomes a very critical development. And I think that some of the themes that I heard was really, when you look back at the literature of the 40s and 50s, there's the same kind of, you have the same Czechoslovakia or Poland, or places like that, there's the same concern that the industrial development, or whatever development it was, would overrun the local craft and technology.
And the process, the Shinto shrine sample, which is, I suspect what all of us know, that whole notion of venerable decay and the recycling, every 20 years you rebuild the building. It seems to me that's not just about preservation. The process of doing that is very much part of a process of worship,
So
which we certainly don't have in the West.
Yeah,
well,
we
maybe with the adobe
But
structure.
I was talking to George the other day about the issue if there is really an absolutely contradictory practice in the East and the West, or if our idea of an authentic original isn't something that has come up during the last 100 years maybe. So in early Europe, there was much more readiness to say, okay, we have to build something new, this has to be up to date, we want to have it new, and then they just fit into an old ensemble that we wouldn't touch today because we think this is embodied heritage. And in 18th century Europe, they were very readily available for recreating something completely new.
But that goes back to the breaking tradition. It's when the building technology tradition, when the building technology tradition breaks, it's also when the tradition, no longer the craft tradition, that stops building. So I think for us, it really is a 19th century or into 100 years or 150 year development because of that change. And that's what you see.
Yeah.
There must be questions from all of you. Sorry, Ms. Ackerman.
To follow up on something you said about, a very strong civic tradition here, and what that means in other cultures. And believe me, as I was preparing for my talk this afternoon, I've been struggling with what is East, what is West. But, I think that a lot of the civic traditions that we prize here in this country are really a result of sort of post-industrial revolution, coming to terms with what is civil society, and also being such a country of immigrants. There were a lot of sort of nation-building activities to try and create a community here, and that's where a lot of our public service civic engagement comes from. And I was thinking, about this issue, and I was thinking that World Monuments Fund had several projects in very remote areas of Ladakh in India, and was working with restoring several monastic buildings that in order to get to them where the road stopped, there's another 2-hour hike up to the monasteries. And in order to get equipment and materials up to repair one of the buildings, it was very badly place that we've been involved with in Peru, in the town called Marca, where a road has only recently been built, and they re-thatched the roof of the church every 3 years as an entire community activity. And the road coming to the town is changing that dynamic, because now it's a tourist destination to go and see the re-thatching of this roof. So, it's an interesting question of, what suddenly tips the balance where these traditions fade away. And so, I thought your comment, it is indeed another whole topic for a Fitch Colloquium, because it's a profound issue about how we engage with our heritage and what that means.
But isn't also partially mutual dependency? Part of it is that once you are so dependent on each other, therefore you have to work together. And I go back to this whole idea. I grew up in Holland, and obviously we're below the water table. And obviously everybody has to agree to keep the dike up, because otherwise you go on the water. So there's a mutual interest. And I think in our urban cultures, we don't necessarily have that.
There must be other. Yeah.
Really enjoyed the presentations this morning. How has the factor of law affected the preservation projects you've undertaken? How has the factor of law affected the preservation projects that you've undertaken? Has it been a barrier, neutral or non-existent, or provided incentives to assist the work that you've engaged in?
I think in some of the examples I showed, there were preservation laws in place, as I mentioned, in the Weishan project, which has generally helped. Certainly, those of us who are involved in the field, the fact that you would go down the main drag and only see wooden shutters and not cheap metal shutters, we like that. But I would argue that the economic forces are bigger than the legal forces in almost all these cases.
And I think that goes across the period, because I think that for modern preservation, the same way, the ultimate decision is an economic one. And they'll tell you that.
Well, I think which is so interesting particularly to your conversation about making sure that the economics are in place. That has to be in place to create a sustainable preservation model, and that is certainly something we grapple with every day upstate New York. The state's a big place, and people don't remember that it's a large rural landscape with a few dying industrial cities. We're not talking New York City here. So that model is crucial. And it's, I think, very important for all of us in the field to recognize that that's really, it's not just about preserving the physical fabric, but it's really creating the context in which that can be sustained. George.
Also wanted to thank Annie Berman for helping us out this morning. I had two related questions. One is, you touched on charters in some respects. Do the charters really act as guiding lights for future practice, or are they simply acknowledgments of or codifying of what practice is going on? And then related, as much as all of the charters touch upon, how we have to respect the cultural impulse and the object itself, do the charters actually globalize and make practice more uniform? And touching to Ann's point about, is all this East-West thing going to go away in 10 years? So are the charters helping us preserve these indigenous values and objects, or is the practice just becoming more uniform, and then therefore the ideas that underlie the practice become more uniform as well?
Well, I guess the argument I was trying to make was that the charters do help, especially Burra, because they're looking at process, not right. Practice. So I would argue that World Heritage is outstanding universal value. That, to me, that's a more fraught concept than a universal process for engagement of a community and making decisions about bringing its past into its future. I think I'm a little more comfortable with the idea that there could be a consistent process as outlined in Burra.
Yeah, and I think Burra is updated, which is, I think, one of the few charters that, as I said, the latest version is March of this year. Well, it started, 79 or something like that. Right. So there really is an evolution in the charter itself, which in most charters is not the case. Venice, we're still talking about Venice, And Venice has been dead for 20 years. I mean, not the city, but the charter. And so, and I think, I liked your comment about the fact that the Venice Charter is a reflection of reconstruction in Europe in post-war periods. And it's in the language, it's in the goals, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, some of the charters are detrimental. I actually kind of like universal value. And I like it because there's no time period. It doesn't say 30 years or 50 years or 25 years or anything. It sort of recognizes value as an absolute value, which I kind of like.
In the back, the hands. A vigorous question in the back.
Two of the presentations were about sites in China. And just to follow on the discussion of charters, I did not hear the China principles mentioned at all. And I was wondering why, and I've actually asked this question of Chinese colleagues, so I sort of know why, but I want to hear your version of why.
Oversight. No, actually, because we did look at those, especially in my work in Weishan, we did look at the China principle, and Tongji is using them, so I'm claiming oversight.
And Pamela, what reason have you heard?
Well, my discussion is that they haven't really been adopted. They've been adopted at the highest levels, right, and they have not trickled down to the local levels. So that's what I've heard, that they're problematic. And I think also problematic is Herb Stovall, now dead, apparently telling them to throw them away. So it's an interesting thing because I know the Getty spent a very long time producing the China principles through stakeholder consultation, through bringing officials to the U.S., bringing them to Australia. Very involved process that took well over 10 years. And it's curious to see that they're really not used that widespreadly in China. So I was just wondering if you say it's oversight, so I get that, but whether or not it was actually oversight or just truly these things are not that useful. So I would ask you as well.
Well, I envision Shaxi as a project and as a geography sort of on the very margins of all that's happening in this discussion. I think that in some senses it's a blank slate because there is so little resistance and so little input from the local community, and there was just such a lack of economy to begin with. But I think that when you have professionals such as Huang Yinwu, who's educated overseas and in Hong Kong and who's very well versed in the vocabulary and in the principles, when he translates those into working in Shaxi, they don't mean much to the locals. So he puts them into effect, but they may not be absorbed by the local community in the same way. And I think that he stressed to me on a couple occasions just how excited and interested everyone is in sort of that initial economic revitalization, that everyone becomes very short-sighted when it comes to issues of long-term preservation and sustainability. So I think it's still a rural, urban, have issue.
Yeah, it's a good question, Pamela, because it comes to the heart of this this colloquium, because you could argue that those principles did sort of come out of the West to some degree, and we referenced them very specifically in doing some sustainability planning in Weishan in 2007, and I think we had sort of the same experience. Yes, you reference them the same way you say we're doing it the right way, but I'm not sure how much resonance they had at the local level.
Just a quick comment, though. This is not defensive. We did invite Neville actually to speak, and this wasn't able to come to one of the offices at the time. So we were trying to bring that into the picture.
Is there a question over here?
It's part comment and question. I'm Rosalie I'm a retired preservation architect, but I'm now president of a nonprofit, Bakas Pilipinas, which we founded to help preserve historic buildings in the Philippines, and which is now in the focus of media right now. Some of the issues are not so much East and West as just poor developing countries, and practical issues. How do you find local partners? And I think all the newscasts now of the typhoon puts into focus the graft and corruption that's in that country. So that's one reality that you have to face and have to be very, very careful. And it's not just government officials, but NGOs as well. So we were working on the preservation of, we're working now on the restoration of a metal church in Manila. And one of our goals was how do we engage the community in this preservation. Unfortunately, the restoration project happened before the engagement of the community, but that's only because of the way the grants work. But we were fortunate to have an anthropologist in our group, and we sent our anthropologists into the community for several months. And that was the best investment we ever had, because our person, who is very, very good, unfortunately she's not here, she helped us identify, people we could work with and all the pitfalls of even getting in there. And right now, those are the things that we're discussing. Are we going in there? Because of this, it's very, very complicated. And we wouldn't have known it if we hadn't sent this anthropologist. So I really, your suggestion of sending sociologists, anthropologists, is very, very valuable, really. And the choice of local partners, it is so critical in countries like the Philippines, where it's a minefield, Thank you.
But I think finding local partners is a problem anywhere. I mean, even in the United States, when you go into a rural community that Anna's talking about, they look upon you as an outsider. So I think that it's a really endemic to what we do.
Yep. Right. Anyone else? There's a question here.
This is not a question. I'm Mei from Hong Kong, so I just want to add a little bit about the modern architecture conservation in Hong Kong, from Hong Kong perspective. In Hong Kong, there's not a according to my mom, there's no history in Hong Kong. There's buildings are only for 50, 70 years old at most, and so there's not a everything is quite new, so we don't think there's a need to restore. There's no history embedded in the building. But recently, there's an emerging concept of collective memory. I think that's very interesting.
I think that in cities like Hong Kong, Seoul, Korea, Singapore, there is a developing interest in modern architecture. But I think where it is right now, and I think some of the images I try to show, we're in the 30s, we're in the 40s.
Right.
And that the most significant development takes place after World War II. And even in Seoul, Korea, they're still struggling with how do you recognize and how do you value that. And on the flip side of that, because it's urban and it's very different, of course, from rural preservation, because so much is development driven, that again, the same discussion in New York is the value of the site begins to override any discussion of what's taking place. So I think that's a struggle that's still coming, and I think it's going to take time to get to the point of being able to recognize the value of heritage, which is quite recent.
There's an awful lot of agreement in the room, which is not. There must be somebody who disagrees with something. Oh, good. There's a hand up in the corner.
Absolutely agree there's limits. I think that there are limits. I think that we see these limits reflected in people like Oning and Zuojing, who I mentioned at the end, who refuse to travel in rural places. They have no interest in being there or going there. And Ai Weiwei, for instance, writes very emphatically about not wanting to travel to Tibet because he doesn't want to see or contribute to that sort of, I don't want to use any too vehement of language, but he just doesn't want to contribute to the sort of parading of this manufactured culture that he doesn't see as authentic or real. And I agree with that to a certain degree. I'm happy to partake in it to a limited degree. I think the idea of ecotourism takes the edge off a little bit. You know, you think if you're contributing in a sustainable sense, or if you're helping locals to build their own economy, it seems to be a little bit more, there's a buffer zone rather than going to Lijiang and watching 56 minorities do a dance in like vibrantly colored clothes, which are obviously not native or indigenous or do not reflect reality. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's very locally. It's a very local question. It depends on who and when and what, but it's definitely one worth exploring. And I wanted to bring up discovery value. I did not do very good theorizing of that, but I noted that in all the literature I had been reading, the word discovery kept coming up over and over again, and people sort of lamenting the fact that once other people had discovered the site, the value of the site had gone down. So I thought it was interesting to bring it up.
I think, let me just also follow up on that. There's sort of tourism development. Ecotourism is sort of a way of phrasing that you want to have tourism development that's not going to destroy the place. And Lijiang, I always would speak about Lijiang as a counterexample because it was sort of like, okay, we're World Heritage now, clean it out, turn it into an economic monoculture that only serves tourism and doesn't serve a local population. There are other types of tourism development. Part of what drives us, the reason we did Weishan when we did, and the reason now through Global Heritage Fund we're doing Guizhou when we did, is because we're trying to get there before the roads get there and get the planning policies in place before it's all of a sudden really easy to get to these places. So you're trying to put some policies in place prior to the onslaught, if you will. You could also argue that plans go by the board. You know, you go to Angkor, they had a great management plan and no one followed it. And so.
I'm wondering if you could address the question of cultural flow from east to west. I was in Beijing this past summer where I gave a workshop at Central Arts Academy, but I happen to live in Queens, in which I've been looking at the transformation of places like Forest Hills, Kew Gardens. There's photographs at Queens College of the transformation of local houses and what's happening with Southeast Asians, Pakistanis, Chinese people in Flushing coming into the communities. And I was running into problems with a developer who I've been fighting for 3 years, and I went to the building commissioner and tried to get this building taken down, but I was not successful. And I told them that I was a former faculty member of Columbia University in this school, and also a faculty member at the Pratt Institute and the Cooper Union, and I got absolutely no help. And I was starting to think about well, where's this sort of like justice for minorities, including Chinese immigrants who are here who don't have a voice? But that's one question. The other question is the architectural integrity of places like Forest Hills, where you have Southeast Asian people coming in. My friend said, John, you shouldn't be racist because you don't agree with some of the stylistic hybridities that are happening with these former British English Tudor-style houses. And then I called one of my former classmates who graduated also here from Columbia, and we discussed these issues, and she said, well, there's not much preservation going on even in Queens. Can any one of you address these issues?
I can't talk about Queens.
I'm not even sure where to start. I think that first I would say that if you look at the history of New York City, it's always been a history of immigrant groups coming in. And that there's always, we can have the same discussion about the Lower East Side, or I can go to London and talk about the East End, where the generations of immigrants come in and change the physical culture. And so I guess my feeling is that I'm not sure that that's bad. And I'm not sure how you would intervene with that. But that may not be your question, but I think that that's sort of where I feel that maybe that's the way it is. That's the way urban development works.
I think it's certainly how it works in New York City. Yeah. The culture of this place is to make as much money as fast as you can.
Well, what else is that? I think you look at East London. I mean, you look at the generations of what was English and then becomes French weavers, and then it becomes, I think, Bangladeshis or whatever wave of inner city housing. I can have the same discussion about the Netherlands, where Turkish populations move into the inner city because it's cheap housing. And so you see that cultural turnover, and then the next generation comes. So I think that's an integral part of urban development. That may not be good, and we may lose things. We may lose Tudor architecture, but I think cultural demographics is how it works.
Sorry. I just want to ask about the question of sustainability, because I was very impressed about the project that some of you are carrying on in China about providing plans or guidelines to the local people, and in terms of to sort of ensure that the project is long-term and sustainable. But I was just wondering if you have a sort of follow-ups or revisit to those sites after you have left, you have done the conservation, preservation there, to sort of see how actually the guidelines or plans that you left have been implemented or followed by the local people, because some of you also addressed that there's a sort of a difference between Western conservators and the local people's perception about preservation of their own sites. So I'm just interested in this kind of.
I mean, certainly the projects I talked about, none of them are over yet. So we haven't left long enough that we need to go back and find out what's happening. But in both cases, what you said is correct. The idea is that the local government would be carrying forward the plan and continuing to support it.
I'm not sure preservation is ever done. I think it's a process, and ensuring the sustainability means somebody has to be paying attention all the time. You don't walk away. It's not like land conservation. I think about this a lot, where that's all about the deal. You know, you go in, the Nature Conservancy goes in, buys a piece of land, sells it back to the feds or whatever, and protects it, and it's done, and they walk away. Preservation doesn't work that way. It's a long process of working with people, of caring for it, being a curator, you know, being a steward of a place, and it doesn't stop. David.
I'd like to say something. I'm not quite sure the gentleman's question here, but if it's about the changing cultural attitudes and cultures in our environment, I think, Ann, you had started, or someone offered the need for the community to buy into the cultural values that created the place. I've spent my entire life working in Newark, where if there had been preservation programs, I'm using that sort of as a broad term, then the revitalization of the entire Ironbound, the east side of the city, wouldn't have happened, because this was a community of primarily Portuguese, supplemented later on by Brazilians, that used its own cultural language as they occupied a space, if you will. If there had been limitations on the means of their cultural expression, I offer that the results would have been markedly different. The flip side is trying with other communities who feel no connection whatsoever, and this is in primarily poor or immigrant communities of various kinds, no connection with that cultural history that's there. It's to say the least, an uphill battle to make any sense of preservation. It's not a question, it's a statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but
it's okay, David. It was brief. It's okay.
We're having a similar problem with a cultural landscape project we're doing in Transylvania, and where you have a indigenous community, Roma, that have moved into Saxon villages, and there isn't a connection to the place. At the same time, I have found in the course of many years working in places like Chicago that people can have a connection to the place even if it isn't directly related to their own identity or cultural production. They may adopt a place because they like some aspect of it, and they may find its history, just as you would in the history of New York, celebrate all of its history, not the part that you have some quote-unquote blood connection to. I think you could argue, on the other hand, though, that control of your environment, whether it's natural or cultural, is sort of a middle-class value.
Like ownership. Like ownership.
Yeah.
A middle-class value.
Yeah.
Really, we're doing better, because too often I hear that, oh, historic preservation is terribly elitist.
Yeah, well, I think the idea that you can, and maybe it was once, that only the elite could control their environment, but I think certainly in this country and increasingly around the world, I think the middle class, part of being middle class is having some say over what goes on around you.
And keeping people out.
To some degree, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the upper class part. A question here.
Yeah, great presentations. Really enjoyed all the information that was shared. I'm wondering if any of you have any experience or knowledge in the intersection. There's been a lot of discussion of the intersection of preservation versus sort of globalization and the quest for development, and those development pressures pressuring land values or increasing land values, and that affects the process. Something else I've observed in Tokyo has been the pressure around another pole, which is disaster prevention. So, for example, in Tokyo, there are several areas that still remain as what they call small wooden house areas. Sumida, in and around Tokyo Tower. Another one, Kagurazaka, which is very famous for its small streets in Roji. And the zoning and other elements have certainly led to increased pressure financially. But on the back burner, or maybe even on the front burner, the government is very interested in clearing those areas out to allow for example, police and fire access. They're very concerned about these areas in the event of a seismic, an earthquake, and their susceptibility and vulnerability to fire. Has anybody sort of come across this sort of tension? I know it's a very strong driving force in planning in Japan and Tokyo.
I don't know much about the regulations, but I know from people I met
that it is a challenge if you live in a historical building, because you once it's designated a historical building, you have to observe the rules. Of course, you can't use air conditioning, what is tedious in summer in Japan. Heating is much of a problem, and actually the wooden structures are much more safe in case of big earthquakes, because they're joined and kind of feathering off the impulses. So the buildings that are most liable to collapse are not high-rise and not wooden, but the residential buildings that you have in most parts of Japan. And actually also in terms of the tsunami, so one of the buildings that is in Matsushima Bay on a small island was completely flooded. It's a 17th century building and it kept standing. And so that's basically something that's advocating of retaining residential areas with wooden buildings. But there is a strong interest in cleaning out, as you say, and I think there is also much pressure because the plots are so valuable that there were big campaigns to clean out the areas prior to having them enlisted as historical buildings. Yeah.
I think Tokyo's concern is not the structural stability of these buildings, it's the proliferation of fire.
Yeah. Yeah, fire is the main problem. Yeah.
I think that in any given area, there is always the balance that needs to be struck between the life safety issues and the physical remains of what it is. And I think the danger is, and that's why I was wondering what the underlying question in your question was, is the argument of that fire, is that argument of the seismic safety being used to clear the land? Because that's sort of the other part of the equation. Back to the example I used in the school, the Japanese school, there was a very subtle, very elegant way of making it seismic better by creating lateral stability. So I think there are ways of doing it, but it requires a level of sophistication on the part of who is doing it, and secondly, it requires a sophistication on the level of the regulatory authority and willing to accept it. So I think it's a very tricky question that plays everywhere. I mean, we can have the same kind of conversation in California.
We probably have time for one more question or comment.
I have a crazy question, but there it is.
Go ahead.
Maybe controversial. I was personally attracted to historic preservation because of the interdisciplinary nature of it. A sense of place, tangible and intangible. We heard a fantastic presentation about process and markets and etc. So really my question is it time to change the word of our field, preservation, and call it something else? And I certainly think so. And what should it be? If you agree, what should be the name? And maybe we should eliminate this word preservation, which I think suggests, I mean, sometimes it doesn't give the right idea of what we're all engaging.
If we can solve that one today, we'll zoom off into the future with great success. Let's talk about that.
I mean, Jim Fish
Right.
called it
Curatorial
4
management.
years ago the retrieval and recycling of the built environment as a start, something different. I don't know.
It's got to be something that sounds really good in an elevator.
Yeah.
Because frankly, you know, you go run into people who work in different industries and they say to you, well, what do you do? And you say, well, I'm a preservationist. And they look utterly blank. Building restoration. Oh, okay, a little bit. They begin together, but we do need a better name.
I've advocated for heritage conservation, but mostly just because that's what they use in the rest of the English-speaking world. I don't know if it's the answer to the question.
So in Japan, it's hozon, so that's also it's mainly preservation, but I guess it's a introduced word.
It needs to be a word that talks about process, that doesn't talk about an end fixed point.
Historic facilitator.
Historic facilitator? No.
I thought I'd take a stab at something.
Maintenance.
Lee, did you have a question or a comment?
I mean, in Chinese, it's directly translated as like cultural
preservation. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, there's different layers of that. You can quantify that. Architectural, intangible, culture,
Well, we need to solve that one. Maybe you all coming up into the next generation can do that for us. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the speakers.